Rain continued for 3 days. It fell in sheets that obscured the mountains and turned the roads to rivers of mud. It drummed against the rooftops of Bursa with a persistence that seemed almost personal, as though the sky itself was determined to wash away every trace of what had happened, every bloodstain on the walls, every memory of the dead that still lingered in the minds of the living. The defenders who had stood against the Karamanid assault retreated to their barracks and their homes, their bodies finally surrendering to the exhaustion that they had held at bay through sheer will. Men who had not slept for days collapsed onto whatever surface was available and did not move for hours that stretched into days. The city, which had been a fortress, became a hospital, a refuge, a place of recovery and mourning, and the slow, painful process of understanding what had been won and what had been lost. Orhan Sahib did not rest. He could not rest. The battle was over, but the work of an empire did not pause for victory. There were wounded to be tended, and he visited them personally, walking through the makeshift infirmaries that had been set up in every available building, speaking to each man who had bled for the cause, thanking them, promising them that their sacrifice would be remembered. There were dead to be buried, and he attended every funeral that his schedule allowed, standing in the rain as the prayers were spoken, watching as the earth received the bodies of men who had given everything. There were reports to be written and messages to be sent, informing allies of the victory, warning enemies that the Osmanli Sultanate had not been weakened, assuring the scattered outposts and fortresses that the center had held. And there were decisions to be made. Always decisions. The Emirate of Germian had arrived in time to tip the balance. Their 5,000 men had appeared on the horizon at precisely the moment when their appearance would matter most, and their presence had convinced Aledin that continued assault was futile. But the Germianids had not come out of charity. They had come because they saw opportunity. They had come because they expected something in return. On the 4th day after the siege was lifted, the rain finally stopped. The clouds parted, and a weak sun emerged, casting long shadows across a landscape that had been transformed by water into something unfamiliar, streams running where roads should be, pools forming in every depression, the world remade by the same element that gave life and took it away. The Germianid envoy arrived at the palace gates that afternoon. Name was Yaqub Bey. He was the younger brother of the Germianid emir, a man of perhaps 30 years, with a face that seemed designed for smiling but that currently wore an expression of careful neutrality. He came with an escort of 50 soldiers, enough to demonstrate importance but not enough to suggest threat. He came with gifts, carefully chosen to flatter without overreaching. He came with demands that had not yet been spoken but that everyone understood were waiting behind the courtesies. Orhan Sahib received him in the Great Hall. The space had been hastily repaired after serving as a command center during the siege. The maps removed, the furniture rearranged, the appearance of normalcy restored even though nothing felt normal anymore. Tarhan stood at Orhan Sahib's right hand, as always. Faladios stood at his left. Jarkutai waited near the door, ostensibly to manage the guard but really to observe, to assess, to add his judgment to whatever would be decided. Yaqub Bey entered with the practiced grace of a man who had spent his life in courts. He bowed with exactly the right depth, held the bow for exactly the right duration, rose with exactly the right expression of respect. His words were formal, his compliments precise, his entire performance calculated to communicate equality rather than submission. The Emirate of Germian extends its congratulations, he said, to Sultan Orhan Sahib on his magnificent victory. The defeat of the Karamanid invasion will be remembered as one of the great achievements of our age. Our emir, my brother, is honored to have played some small part in this triumph. Orhan Sahib listened. He had expected something like this. The formula of diplomacy, the dance of words that preceded the real conversation. The Osmanli Sultanate is grateful for the assistance of the Emirate of Germian, he replied, matching Yaqub Bey's formality. Your arrival was timely. Your forces were instrumental. We will not forget what was done. Yaqub Bey smiled. It was a genuine smile, or at least a very good imitation of one. We are neighbors, he said. We share borders. We share enemies. It was natural that we should stand together against a common threat. He paused. The pause was calculated, a signal that the preliminaries were ending and the substance was about to begin. But standing together creates obligations, he continued, bonds that should be strengthened, relationships that should be formalized. My brother has asked me to propose an arrangement that would benefit both our peoples. Orhan Sahib nodded. He had expected this as well. The Germianids had not marched to war out of goodwill. They wanted something. Speak, he said. Yaqub Bey took a breath. He was about to ask for something significant, something that would test the limits of Osmanli gratitude. A marriage, he said, between your family and ours. A union that would bind our houses together, that would make our alliance permanent, that would ensure that our peoples stand together not just in this generation, but in all the generations to come. Orhan Sahib felt Tarhan shift slightly beside him. The movement was almost imperceptible, a subtle tensing of muscles, a readiness for whatever might come next. A marriage, Orhan Sahib repeated, between whom? Yaqub Bey's smile widened. My brother has a daughter, he said, Sultana Hattis. She is 17 years old, beautiful, educated, trained in all the arts that befit a woman of noble birth. My brother proposes that she be wed to your son, your heir, the future sultan. The words hung in the air. Orhan Sahib's son, his heir Suleiman, who was 12 years old, who had just begun his training in the arts of war and governance, who was still a child in most ways that mattered. This was not a simple request. This was a bid for influence. A Germianid princess as the wife of the future sultan would mean Germianid influence at the heart of Osmanli power. It would mean obligations that extended far beyond the current generation. It would mean tying the fate of the Osmanli dynasty to the fate of the Germianids in ways that could not be easily undone. Orhan Sahib was silent for a long moment. He was thinking, calculating, weighing the benefits against the costs, the opportunities against the risks. The Germianids had saved Bursa. That was true. Without their arrival, the siege might have continued for weeks, might have succeeded, might have ended everything. But gratitude had limits, and binding decisions about the future of the dynasty to the emotions of a single moment was not how empires were built. Your brother's proposal is generous, Orhan Sahib said finally. It deserves careful consideration. A marriage of such significance cannot be decided in haste. I will consult with my advisors. I will seek the guidance of the Almighty, and I will give you an answer in due time. Yaqub Bey's smile flickered. It was not the immediate acceptance he had hoped for, but it was not a rejection either. Of course, he said, such matters require deliberation. We will await your decision with patience and hope. He bowed again. The audience was over. He was escorted from the hall with full honors, his gifts accepted, his proposal acknowledged, his position neither strengthened nor weakened. When he was gone, Orhan Sahib turned to Tarhan. Your thoughts, he said. Tarhan considered before speaking. The alliance is valuable, he said. The Germianids are strong. Their territory provides a buffer against threats from the south. Binding them to us through marriage would secure that buffer for generations. But Orhan Sahib prompted. But your son is 12 years old, Tarhan continued. He is not ready for marriage. He is not ready for the responsibilities that marriage would bring. And the Germianid princess would come with advisors, with expectations, with influences that would shape your son's mind at precisely the age when his mind is most impressionable. Orhan Sahib nodded. He had thought the same things. Flavius, he said. Flavius stepped forward. There is another consideration, he said. The Germianids sent 5,000 men. That was significant, but they sent them at the last moment when victory was already becoming likely. They waited until they knew which way the battle would turn before committing themselves. That is not the behavior of true allies. That is the behavior of opportunists. He paused. I do not say they are our enemies, he continued. They are not, but they are also not our friends. They are our neighbors, and neighbors calculate. If we bind ourselves too closely to them, we give them leverage. If we refuse them entirely, we create an enemy where there was a neutral party. The middle path, Orhan Sahib said. Flavius nodded. Accept the principle of the marriage, he suggested, but delay the execution. Say that your son is too young. Say that the formalities must be observed. Say that the wedding will take place in 5 years or 7 or whenever circumstances allow. This gives the Germianids what they want, or at least the promise of it, but it also gives you time. Time to see how the alliance develops. Time to assess whether the Germianids are truly reliable. Time to prepare your son for what lies ahead. Orhan Sahib considered this. It was a diplomatic solution, a way of saying yes and no at the same time, a way of preserving options while appearing to commit. He did not like it. He preferred clarity. He preferred decisions that were made and then followed through. The ambiguity of diplomacy felt like weakness, like an admission that he could not simply dictate terms and have them obeyed. But he was not in a position to dictate terms. The siege had shown that. The Karamanids had nearly destroyed everything. The Germianids had helped save it. Those facts created obligations that could not be ignored. We will accept the proposal in principle, he said finally. We will agree to the marriage, but we will insist on a delay of 5 years. Suleiman must complete his education. He must be ready to take on the responsibilities of marriage and governance. The Germianids will understand this. They will have no choice but to accept. And if they refuse, Tarhan asked. Then we will know that their friendship was never real, Orhan Sahib replied, and we will act accordingly. He turned toward the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to echo the fires that had burned during the siege. Send word to Yaqub Bey, he said. Tell him that our answer will be given formally tomorrow, and have my son brought to me. It is time that he began to understand what his future holds. Suleiman arrived an hour later. He was 12 years old, tall for his age, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's gentle mouth. He had been training with the soldiers during the siege, too young to fight on the walls but old enough to carry messages, to bring water and bandages, to see what war looked like up close. The experience had changed him. There was a seriousness in his eyes that had not been there before, an awareness of mortality that most children were spared. He bowed to his father and waited to be addressed. Orhan Sahib looked at his son. He remembered when this boy had been born, remembered the joy and the terror that had accompanied the arrival of an heir. He remembered watching Suleiman take his first steps, speak his first words, hold a wooden sword for the first time. He remembered all the moments that had led to this moment, all the decisions that had shaped this child into the person who stood before him now. Sit, he said, gesturing to a cushion across from his own. Suleiman sat. He did not speak. He had learned that his father would tell him what he needed to know. You have seen war, Orhan Sahib began. You have seen what it costs. You have seen men die. You have seen the price that must be paid for everything we have built. Suleiman nodded. What I am about to tell you, Orhan Sahib continued, is about a different kind of war, a war that is fought with words instead of swords, a war that requires patience instead of courage, a war that you will have to fight for the rest of your life. He paused, making sure his son was listening. The Germianids have proposed that you marry their princess, he said, Sultana Hattis. She is 17 years old. In 5 years, when you are 17, you will wed her. This will bind our houses together and secure an alliance that will protect our southern border. Suleiman's eyes widened slightly. Marriage had not been something he had thought about. It was an abstract concept, something that adults did, not something that concerned a 12-year-old boy. Do you understand what this means? Orhan Sahib asked. Suleiman thought for a moment before answering. It means that I will not choose my own wife, he said. It means that my marriage will serve the Sultanate, not my own wishes. Orhan Sahib nodded. That is correct, he said, and how do you feel about that? Suleiman was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady. I feel that I was born to serve the Sultanate, he said. If this marriage serves the Sultanate, then it is my duty to accept it. My feelings are secondary. Orhan Sahib studied his son. The words were correct. They were the words that a future sultan should speak, but were they genuine, or were they simply the words that Suleiman thought his father wanted to hear? He could not know. He could not see into his son's heart. He could only hope that the boy who spoke these words would grow into a man who believed them. Good, he said, in 5 years you will be ready. Use those years well. Learn everything you can. Become the sultan that this sultanate needs. And when the time comes, marry the Germianid princess with honor and make the alliance strong. Suleiman bowed his head. I will not disappoint you, father. Orhan Sahib reached out and placed his hand on his son's shoulder. I know, he said, I know you will not. He released his son and turned away. Go, he said, return to your studies. There is much to learn and time passes quickly. Suleiman rose, bowed, and departed. Orhan Sahib stood alone in the chamber, watching the last light of day fade from the sky. 5 years. In 5 years his son would be married. In 5 years, the next generation would begin to take shape. In 5 years, everything he had built would begin to pass into other hands. He was not old. He had many years left if the Almighty willed it. But the future was already visible on the horizon, already approaching, already demanding attention. The work of building an empire was never finished. The work of raising an heir was just as endless. Both continued, both demanded everything. Both were worth every sacrifice. Meanwhile, in the women's quarters of the palace, another conversation was taking place. Niloufar had heard about the Germianid proposal. The palace had no secrets, not really. Information flowed through its halls like water through a riverbed, finding every channel, reaching every ear. By the time Orhan Sahib had finished his conversation with Suleiman, Niloufar already knew that her son was to be married to a foreign princess. She sat in her chamber, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully composed. Malhun sat across from her, watching her daughter with the patient attention that had guided their family through countless crises. "You have something to say," Malhun observed. Nilafar did not respond immediately. She was gathering her thoughts, arranging her feelings into something that could be expressed without revealing too much. "He did not consult me," she said finally. "He did not ask my opinion. He simply decided, and then he told our son." Malhun nodded. "He is the Sultan," she said. "He does not require consultation." "I am Suleiman's mother," Nilafar replied. "I carried him in my body. I nursed him at my breast. I have been with him every day of his life. Does that count for nothing?" "It counts for much," Malhun said, "but it does not give you authority over matters of state. The marriage of the heir is a matter of state. It affects alliances, treaties, the balance of power between nations. These are not decisions that mothers make." Nilafar's composure cracked slightly. "Then what am I?" she asked. "What is my role? To bear children and then watch as others decide their fates? To stand aside while my son is given to a stranger, to a foreigner, to a girl I have never met?" "Your role," Malhun said gently, "is to prepare him, to ensure that when the time comes he is ready, to teach him the things that his tutors cannot teach, the things that only a mother can know. That is your role. It is not a small role. It is perhaps the most important role of all." Nilafar looked at her mother. The anger that had been building in her chest began to fade, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of acceptance and resignation, and a determination that she did not yet know how to express. "I want to meet her," she said, "the princess. Before the wedding, I want to see who my son will be bound to." Malhun considered this. "That could be arranged," she said. "In time, when the formalities have been completed and the alliance has been secured, it would be natural for you to meet your future daughter-in-law." Nilafar nodded. "Then arrange it," she said. "Tell my husband that I request this. Tell him that I accept the decision, but that I wish to be part of what comes next." Malhun smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "I will tell him," she said, "and he will listen. He always listens, even when it seems that he does not." She rose and left the chamber. Nilafar remained seated. She looked at the window, at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Her son was going to be married, to a foreign princess, to a girl who would share his bed, bear his children, influence his decisions for the rest of his life. And Nilafar, who had been the first wife, the mother of the heir, the woman who had stood beside Orhan Sahib through everything, would have to watch, would have to accept, would have to find a way to navigate this new reality without losing herself in the process. It was not fair, but then nothing was fair. Life was a series of adjustments, a constant process of accommodation to circumstances that one did not choose. She would adjust, she always adjusted. But she would not be passive. She would not simply watch as her son's future was shaped by others. She would find a way to influence events, to protect her son, to ensure that the Jermianid princess understood exactly who she was dealing with. The war that Orhan Sahib had described to Suleiman, the war of words and patience and calculation, Nilafar had been fighting that war her entire life. She was very good at it. And she was not about to stop now. Asporka learned of the marriage proposal the same night. She was in her chambers preparing for sleep when one of her attendants brought the news. The attendant was a young woman named Elena, a Byzantine like Asporka herself, one of the few connections to her former life that Asporka had been allowed to maintain. Elena was loyal, discreet, and very good at learning things that others wished to keep hidden. "The Jermianids have proposed a marriage," Elena reported. "The Sultan's son is to wed their princess." Asporka absorbed this information. She felt something, she was not sure what, not jealousy exactly. She had no particular attachment to Suleiman, who was just a child, a boy she had barely spoken to, but something. Perhaps it was the realization that the world was moving forward, that decisions were being made that would shape the future of the dynasty, and that she was not part of those decisions. She had been learning, she had been studying, she had been trying to become the wife that Orhan Sahib had demanded she become, but learning was not the same as doing, studying was not the same as acting. She was still on the outside, still watching as others shaped events that would determine her fate. "This is how it works," she said, more to herself than to Elena. "Marriages are made, alliances are formed, children are traded like currency, their futures decided before they are old enough to understand what is happening." Elena nodded but said nothing. Asporka went to the window. She looked out at the same stars that Nilafar was watching from her own chamber, the same stars that had watched over the siege, over the battle, over everything that had happened since she had come to this palace. "I need to do something," she said. "I need to be useful. I cannot simply wait here, learning and studying, while the world changes around me." "What would you do?" Elena asked.
Aspoka thought.
"The Germianid princess," she said, "Sultana Hattis. She will come here in 5 years to marry Suleiman. Someone will need to receive her. Someone will need to help her adjust to life in this palace. Someone who understands what it means to be a foreign bride in a foreign court." Elena's eyes widened slightly. "You would offer yourself for that role?" she asked. "Why not?" Aspoka replied. "I know what she will face. I know the challenges, the loneliness, the difficulty of finding one's place in a world that was not made for you. Who better to guide her than someone who has walked the same path?" It was audacious. It was presumptuous. It was exactly the kind of initiative that Orhan Saheb had demanded when he told her to stop running and start becoming. But it was also risky. Nilafar would see it as an intrusion. The palace politics were complex enough without adding another layer of competition, and there was no guarantee that Orhan Saheb would approve. Still, risk was part of the game. Risk was how influence was gained. Risk was how someone moved from being a spectator to being a participant. "Find out what you can about Sultana Hattis," Aspoka instructed. "Her personality, her education, her interests, everything that might be useful." Elena bowed. "It will be done." She departed. Aspoka remained at the window, watching the stars, thinking about the future. 5 years was a long time. Many things could change in 5 years. Alliances could form and dissolve. Enemies could rise and fall. The entire balance of power could shift in ways that no one could predict. But 5 years was also a very short time. 5 years was barely enough to establish oneself, to build relationships, to create the network of obligations and loyalties that would be necessary to survive and thrive in this palace. She had 5 years. She had better use them well. The formal acceptance of the Germianid proposal was delivered the following day. Yaqub Bey received the news with appropriate expressions of pleasure and gratitude. He promised that his brother would be delighted, that the Emirate of Germian would prove worthy of the honor, that the alliance between their peoples would grow stronger with each passing year. He departed the next morning, riding back toward his own lands with the triumphant air of a man who had accomplished his mission. And Orhan Saheb, watching him go from the palace walls, felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The alliance was secured. That was good. The southern border would be protected. The Germianids would be bound to the Osmanli cause. The threat from that direction was neutralized, at least for the immediate future. But alliances were fragile things. They depended on shared interests, and interests changed. They depended on trust, and trust was easily broken. They depended on the belief that both parties would honor their commitments, and that belief was often misplaced. Orhan Saheb had learned not to rely too heavily on any single alliance. He had learned to maintain multiple relationships, to keep options open, to never place all his hopes in one basket. The Germianids were allies now, but they might not be allies forever, and when they stopped being allies, Orhan Saheb needed to be ready. He turned from the walls and walked back into the palace. There was work to do. There was always work to do. In the weeks that followed, the city of Bursa slowly recovered from the siege. The dead were buried, the wounded healed or died. The walls were repaired, the defenses strengthened, the garrison reinforced with fresh soldiers drawn from the eastern territories. The merchants returned to the markets, the farmers returned to the fields, and life resumed its normal rhythms. But nothing was quite the same as it had been before. The siege had changed something. It had reminded everyone that the peace they enjoyed was fragile, that the safety they took for granted could be shattered in an instant, that the enemies who wished them harm were real and numerous and patient. The celebrations that followed the victory were genuine, but they were also tinged with an awareness of mortality, a recognition that the next crisis was already forming somewhere beyond the horizon. Orhan Saheb felt this awareness most keenly of all. He threw himself into the work of strengthening the Sultanate. He expanded the army, recruiting soldiers from every corner of his domains. He built new fortresses along the eastern border, ensuring that the Karamanids would face a wall of stone and steel if they ever attempted another invasion. He sent diplomats to every neighboring power, building relationships, gathering intelligence, positioning the Osmanli Sultanate as a force that could not be ignored. And he spent time with his son. Suleiman's education had always been important, but now it became urgent. The boy who would one day rule needed to understand not just the theory of governance but the practice. He needed to see how decisions were made, how alliances were formed, how enemies were defeated. He needed to be prepared for everything that his future would bring. Orhan Sahib took Suleiman to council meetings. He explained the reasoning behind each decision. He showed his son the maps and the reports and the endless stream of information that flowed into the palace from every corner of the known world. He taught him that a sultan was not simply a warrior but a manager, a diplomat, a judge, a priest, a father to his people in every sense of the word. Suleiman absorbed everything. He asked questions that revealed a sharp mind. He made observations that surprised his tutors with their insight. He was becoming, day by day, the heir that the sultanate needed. But he was still a child, and children needed more than lessons. They needed play and friendship, and the simple joys of youth that would be denied to them soon enough. Orhan Sahib understood this. He made sure that Suleiman's education included time for hunting and riding, and the companionship of boys his own age. He made sure that his son was not crushed by the weight of expectation before he had a chance to develop the strength to bear it. It was a delicate balance. Everything was a delicate balance. But Orhan Sahib had learned to maintain delicate balances. It was what sultans did. 3 months after the siege, Tarhan came to Orhan Sahib with news. The two men met in the private chamber where they had discussed so many matters of importance over the years. The room was simple, functional, reflecting the practical nature of their relationship. There were maps on the walls and weapons on racks, and nothing that could be called luxurious. Tarhan did not waste time with pleasantries. "We have received word from our contacts in the Karamanid territories," he said. "Alidin is rebuilding. He has consolidated his power. He has purged those who questioned his leadership after the failed siege. He is preparing for another attempt." Orhan Sahib nodded. He had expected this. The Karamanids were not the kind of enemy who accepted defeat gracefully. They would return. The only questions were when and with what force. "How long?" he asked. Tarhan considered. "Our sources estimate 2 years," he said. "Perhaps 3. He needs time to rebuild his army, to secure his supplies, to eliminate any internal opposition. He will not move until he is certain of success." 2 years, 3 years. Time to prepare. Time to strengthen. Time to ensure that when the Karamanids came again, they would find an enemy even more formidable than the one they had faced before. "And what of his allies?" Orhan Sahib asked. "Is he seeking support from other powers?" "There are rumors," Tarhan replied. "Contacts with the Mamluks. Possible negotiations with the remnants of the Byzantine court. Nothing confirmed, but the possibility exists." The Mamluks, the Byzantines. Old enemies who might see the Karamanid resurgence as an opportunity to weaken the Osmanlis without risking their own forces directly. The web of alliances grew more complex with each passing day. "Continue monitoring," Orhan Sahib instructed. "I want to know everything, every meeting, every message, every movement. If Alidin so much as sneezes, I want to know about it." Tarhan nodded. "And there is one more thing," he said. His tone changed slightly, becoming more hesitant than Orhan Sahib was accustomed to hearing from his most trusted commander. "Speak," Orhan Sahib said. Tarhan took a breath. "There have been reports," he said, "of a man traveling through the Western territories. A man who claims to be a prophet. A man who preaches that the end of days is approaching, that the great powers will fall, that a new age is dawning." Orhan Sahib frowned. "A prophet," he repeated. "There are always prophets. They appear after every war, every famine, every disaster. They prey on the fears of the people and offer false hope. Why should this one concern us?" "Because this one is gathering followers," Tarhan replied. "Thousands of them. He is not simply preaching. He is organizing, building something that looks less like a religious movement and more like an army." Orhan Sahib was silent for a moment. "His name?" he asked. "They call him the Mahdi," Tarhan said, "the guided one, but his real name is unknown. He conceals his identity, appearing only to his inner circle, speaking to the masses through intermediaries." A prophet who conceals his identity, a religious movement that looks like an army, thousands of followers who believed that the end of days was approaching. This was potentially more dangerous than the Karamanids. The Karamanids were a conventional enemy, one that could be understood, predicted, defeated with conventional methods. But a religious movement was something else entirely. Religious movements did not respond to military force the way armies did. They grew stronger when persecuted, spread faster when suppressed, drew power from the very opposition that was meant to destroy them. "Find out more," Orhan Sahib instructed. "Who is this man? Where does his support come from? What does he actually want? Is he a threat to us, or is he simply another madman who will burn himself out before he accomplishes anything? Tarhan nodded. It will be done. He departed. Orhan Sahib sat alone in the simple room, surrounded by maps and weapons, and he felt the weight of his position more heavily than he had felt it in a long time. The Karamanids, the Jermianids, the Mamluks, the Byzantines, and now a prophet who might or might not be a threat. The world was full of enemies, full of challenges, full of forces that wanted to tear down what he had built. And he was just one man trying to hold together an empire, to raise an heir, to build something that would last beyond his own lifetime. He rose and went to the window. The sun was setting again. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red, the same colors that had painted it every evening since the beginning of time. The world did not care about empires. The world did not care about sultans or prophets or armies. The world simply turned, day after day, year after year, indifferent to the struggles of the creatures who lived upon it. But those creatures cared. Those creatures fought and bled and died for things they believed in. Those creatures built walls and wrote laws and raised children and hoped that their efforts would mean something. That was what it meant to be human. That was what it meant to be a sultan. To care, to fight, to hope. Even when the odds were against you. Even when the enemies were many. Even when the world seemed determined to destroy everything you had built. You kept going, you kept fighting, you kept building. Because the alternative was surrender. And Orhan Sahib had never surrendered. He never would. The sun set, the stars emerged, the world turned. And somewhere in the darkness, the future waited. Ready to be shaped. Ready to be conquered. Ready to become whatever Orhan Sahib and his heirs made of it. The story continued. As it always did. As it always would. Until the last word was written. And perhaps not even then. Perhaps not even then. The thunder had passed, but the rain had not come. The clouds hung suspended over the land like a promise that refused to be kept, heavy with water that would not fall, pressing down upon the mountains and the valleys and the rivers that wound through the territories that Orhan Sahib was slowly, methodically, irrevocably claiming as his own. It was the kind of weather that made men uneasy, that settled into bones and spirits alike, that whispered of things yet to happen, of storms delayed but not cancelled, of reckonings postponed but approaching nonetheless. 3 weeks had passed since Tarhan had ridden west with his cavalry. 3 weeks since Flavius had begun his diplomatic circuit among the Byzantine nobility. 3 weeks since Jarkutai had taken command of the garrison and begun the work of transforming raw recruits into soldiers worthy of the Osmanli banner. 3 weeks of reports arriving daily, of maps being updated, of plans being refined and adjusted, and sometimes abandoned entirely, as the reality on the ground revealed itself to be different from the assumptions that had shaped the planning. Orhan Sahib stood in the council chamber, alone except for the maps and the candles and the weight of everything that rested upon his decisions. He had sent his servants away hours ago. He had told them that he needed to think, and they had bowed and departed, understanding that when their sultan said he needed to think, he meant that he needed to wrestle with problems that no servant could help him solve. The Western campaign was proceeding well, better than well. Tarhan had taken 4 more fortresses without significant resistance. The Byzantine garrisons, demoralized and abandoned, had surrendered one after another, accepting the terms that were offered, departing with their lives and their personal possessions, leaving behind positions that the Osmanli forces immediately occupied and began to strengthen. The road to the Byzantine heartland was opening, fortress by fortress, mile by mile. Flavius's diplomatic efforts were bearing fruit as well. 3 of the Byzantine nobles he had approached had already declared their allegiance to the Osmanli Sultanate. Others were wavering, waiting to see if the tide would continue in its current direction before committing themselves. Only a handful had refused outright, and those refusals had been noted, recorded, filed away for future attention. But something was wrong. Orhan Sahib could feel it. He could not identify it, could not point to any specific report or piece of intelligence and say that is the problem. But the feeling was there nonetheless, a prickling at the back of his neck, a tightness in his chest, the instinct that had kept him alive through dozens of campaigns and hundreds of moments when death had been close enough to touch. Something was wrong. He returned to the maps. He traced the routes that Tarhan was following, the positions of the fortresses that had been taken, the locations of the ones that remained. He studied the terrain, looking for choke points, for places where an enemy force might hide, for any feature of the landscape that might conceal a threat. Nothing presented itself. The maps showed what they had always shown. The reports confirmed what the maps suggested. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And yet, a knock at the door. Orhan Sahib turned. "Come," he said. The door opened. Jakutai entered. The veteran commander looked tired. The work of training recruits was exhausting, physically and emotionally, demanding a kind of patience that warfare rarely required. But beneath the tiredness was something else, an alertness, a tension, the same feeling that Orhan Sahib himself had been wrestling with. "Forgive the intrusion," Jakutai said. "I would not have come unless it was necessary." Orhan Sahib gestured for him to approach. "Speak." Jakutai came to the table. He looked at the maps, then looked at Orhan Sahib, and his expression was troubled. "I have received word," he said, "from a source I trust, a merchant who travels between our lands and the Byzantine territories. He brings news that has not yet reached the official channels." Orhan Sahib waited. "There is movement in the east," Jakutai continued. "Not the Byzantines, someone else, an army gathering in the mountains beyond the border. The merchant did not know whose army. He knew only that it was large, well-equipped, and that it was not making any effort to conceal itself." Orhan Sahib felt the feeling in his chest tighten. The east, the mountains, an army that was not Byzantine. "How large?" he asked. "The merchant estimated 10,000, Jakutai said. "Perhaps more. He is not a military man. His estimates may be imprecise. But even if he is exaggerating by half, we are speaking of a force that equals our own." Orhan Sahib turned back to the maps. The eastern border was not where his attention had been focused. The Byzantines were in the west. The diplomatic opportunities were in the north. The east had been quiet, had been neglected, had been assumed to be secure because the enemies in that direction had been defeated or neutralized years ago. But enemies did not stay defeated forever. Enemies rebuilt. Enemies found new allies. Enemies waited for the moment when attention was elsewhere, when forces were committed to other campaigns, when the opportunity for a devastating strike presented itself. "Who?" Orhan Sahib said, and the single word contained every question that needed to be asked. Jakutai shook his head. The merchant did not know. He saw banners, but he did not recognize them. He saw armor and weapons, but they were not in any style he was familiar with. He only knew that they were coming, and that they were coming soon. Orhan Sahib was silent for a long moment. His mind raced through possibilities. Old enemies who might have regrouped, new enemies who might have emerged, allies of the Byzantines who might have been mobilized in response to Shahanshah's defeat, powers from beyond the known borders who might have decided that this was their moment to enter the contest. Any of these was possible, all of them were dangerous. "Send riders," he said finally. "Send them east fast with orders to observe and report. I need to know who they are, how many they truly number, what direction they are moving, and how quickly they are moving in that direction. Do not engage, do not reveal yourselves, simply watch and return with information." Jakutai nodded. "It will be done." "And send word to Turhan," Orhan Sahib continued. "Tell him to halt his advance and consolidate the positions he has taken. Tell him to be prepared to return at speed if I send for him. Do not tell him why, simply tell him to be ready." Jakutai nodded again. He turned to go, then paused at the door. "And Flavius?" he asked. Orhan Sahib considered. Flavius's diplomatic mission was delicate. Interrupting it might undo weeks of careful work, but if there was truly an army approaching from the east, diplomatic progress would mean nothing if that army reached Bursa before it could be stopped. "Continue the mission," he said, "but tell Flavius to accelerate his timeline. Tell him to conclude whatever negotiations he can conclude in the next week, and then return. Tell him that circumstances may require his presence here sooner than expected." Jakutai bowed and departed. Orhan Sahib stood alone in the council chamber. The candles flickered. The maps lay spread before him, suddenly inadequate, suddenly revealing how much of the world remained unknown, unmapped, full of threats that he had not anticipated. He had been warned by his own instincts, by the feeling that had been gnawing at him for days. He had known that something was wrong, and now he knew what it was. But knowing what was wrong and knowing how to address it were different things. He needed information. He needed time. He needed his forces concentrated rather than scattered across campaigns that suddenly seemed less urgent than they had seemed this morning. He needed, most of all, to understand who was coming and what they wanted. And until he understood that, every decision he made would be a gamble. He did not enjoy gambling. But he did not have a choice. The night passed slowly. Orhan Sahib did not sleep. He sat with the maps and the reports and his own thoughts, turning the problem over in his mind, examining it from every angle, looking for solutions that did not require abandoning everything he had built over the past months. Dawn came grey and heavy, the clouds still holding their rain, the sun struggling to break through. The palace woke around him. Servants appeared with food that he did not eat. Advisors appeared with questions that he answered with half his attention, the other half still fixed on the eastern border and what might be approaching from beyond it. By midday, the first of the riders he had sent returned. The man was exhausted, his horse lathered and spent, his face grey with dust and fatigue. But his eyes were alert, and when he spoke, his words were clear and precise. "I reached the edge of the mountains," he said. "I saw the army. It is real. It is large, larger than the merchant estimated. I counted banners. I counted cooking fires. I estimate 15,000 men, perhaps 20. They are well organized. They move with discipline, and they are moving toward us." Orhan Sahib felt a cold certainty settle into his stomach. 20,000 men, moving toward Bursa, moving toward everything he had built. "Their banners," he said, "describe them." The rider thought for a moment. "Black," he said, "black with silver markings, symbols I did not recognize, not Byzantine, not any of the powers I know." Black with silver markings. Orhan Sahib searched his memory. He had studied the banners of every significant power in the region. He had made it his business to know who might one day be a threat, what symbols they flew, what traditions they followed. Black with silver. The memory surfaced slowly, rising from depths where it had been buried for years. A conversation with an old advisor, a man who had traveled widely before entering Osmanli service. Stories of powers beyond the eastern mountains. Powers that had once been great, that had fallen into decline, that were said to be rebuilding, reclaiming their former strength. The Karamanids. The word fell from his lips before he consciously formed it. The rider looked at him with confusion. "Sultan." "Nothing," Orhan Sahib said. "You have done well. Rest, recover, I may need you again soon." The rider bowed and departed. Orhan Sahib stood in the council chamber, and for the first time in years, he felt something that might have been fear. The Karamanids. They were an old power, one that had contested with the Osmanlis for dominance generations ago, before Orhan Sahib's grandfather had defeated them and pushed them back into the mountains. They had been quiet since then. Broken, everyone had assumed. Finished. Everyone had been wrong. 20,000 men, disciplined, well-equipped, moving with the confidence of a force that expected to win. This was not a raiding party. This was not a probing attack. This was an invasion. And Orhan Sahib's forces were scattered across the western territories, pursuing campaigns that suddenly seemed monumentally unimportant. He had perhaps 10 days before the Karamanid army reached Bursa, perhaps less if they forced the pace. 10 days to gather his forces, 10 days to prepare his defenses, 10 days to find some way to turn what appeared to be an overwhelming disadvantage into something that might, with luck and skill and the blessing of the Almighty, become a victory. He called for Jakutai. The veteran commander appeared within minutes. "Send the fastest riders we have," Orhan Sahib ordered. "Turhan returns immediately. Every man, every horse. Tell him to abandon the fortresses he cannot hold and hold only those that are essential. Tell him to march day and night. I need him here within a week." Jakutai nodded, but his face showed his concern. "The western fortresses," he said, "if we abandon them." "The western fortresses mean nothing if we lose Bursa," Orhan Sahib interrupted. "The Byzantines can take them back. We can retake them later. But if the Karamanids take Bursa, there will be no later." Jakutai absorbed this. He nodded again, more firmly this time. "It will be done." "And Faladios," Orhan Sahib continued. "The same message. Return immediately. Whatever negotiations remain incomplete will remain incomplete. I need every sword we have." "And the garrison?" Jakutai asked. "The recruits?" Orhan Sahib looked at the old commander. The recruits were not ready. They had been training for weeks, but weeks were not enough to turn civilians into soldiers. They could hold a wall if the wall was strong. They could stand in a line if the line was supported by veterans. But they could not fight in the open, not against a disciplined enemy that outnumbered them, not against the kind of force that the Karamanids were bringing. "They will hold the walls," Orhan Sahib said. "That is what we train them for first. That is what they will do." Jakutai bowed. He turned to go, then paused, as he had paused the night before. "Sultan," he said, "the Karamanids, they have been quiet for so long. Why now? Why this moment?" Orhan Sahib shook his head. He did not know, he could guess, the defeat of Shahanshah, the extension of Osmanli forces to the west, the appearance of vulnerability, of overreach, of an empire that had grown too fast and spread too thin. But guesses were not knowledge, and knowledge was what he needed. Find out, he said, use every source we have, every merchant, every traveler, every spy. Someone knows why the Karamanids are moving, someone knows what they want. Find that someone and bring me what they know. Jarkutai departed, and Orhan Sahib was alone again. Alone with the maps that showed an enemy approaching. Alone with the knowledge that everything he had built might be destroyed within weeks. Alone with the weight of decisions that would determine whether his dynasty survived or fell. He went to the window. He looked out at Bursa, at the city that had become the heart of Osmanli power, at the minarets and the markets and the streets where people went about their daily lives without knowing what was coming toward them. He had 10 days. 10 days to prepare for a battle that he might not win. 10 days to find some way to save everything. He closed his eyes. He recited the words of prayer that came automatically, words that he had spoken thousands of times, words that connected him to something larger than himself, larger than this moment, larger than any single crisis. And when he opened his eyes, the fear was still there, but it was contained now, managed, channeled into something that could be used. Fear was just information. Fear told you that the situation was dangerous. Fear reminded you that complacency was not an option. Fear could be a weakness. Or fear could be a weapon. Orhan Sahib had learned long ago which kind his fear would be. He returned to the maps. He began to plan. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Riders departed in every direction, carrying messages, gathering information, pulling the scattered threads of Osmanli power back toward Bursa. Turhan received his orders and immediately began his forced march eastward, abandoning 3 of the newly won fortresses and leaving skeleton garrisons in 2 others. Flavius concluded what negotiations he could and left the rest unfinished, riding hard with his diplomatic party, trading their ceremonial robes for riding gear as they pushed their horses toward home. In Bursa, the preparations were relentless. Jarkutai worked the recruits from dawn until after dark, drilling them in the basics of wall defense, teaching them where to stand, how to hold their weapons, when to strike and when to wait. The city's defenses were inspected and reinforced. Weak points were identified and strengthened. Supplies were gathered, counted, stored where they could be accessed during a siege. The civilians were told, not everything, not the full scope of the danger, but enough to prepare them, to explain why the soldiers were suddenly everywhere, why the walls were being reinforced, why the atmosphere in the city had shifted from complacent peace to nervous anticipation. Some panicked, some fled, but most stayed. Most had nowhere else to go, and most trusted that their sultan would protect them, that the same man who had defeated Shahanshah and conquered the western fortresses would find some way to defeat this new enemy as well. Orhan Sahib hoped their trust was not misplaced. He hoped, but he did not rely on hope. He relied on planning, on preparation, on the hard work of giving himself every possible advantage before the battle began. The intelligence trickled in, pieces of a puzzle that gradually assembled itself into a picture. The Karamanids were led by a man named Alidin. He was young, ambitious, charismatic. He had spent years rebuilding the power that his ancestors had lost. He had unified the fractured tribes of the eastern mountains. He had equipped them with weapons purchased from distant powers. He had trained them in tactics borrowed from every military tradition he could study. And he had waited for exactly this moment, waited for the Osmanlis to overextend themselves, waited for the opportunity that Shahanshah's defeat had created. He was not stupid, he was not impulsive, he was methodical, patient, and utterly committed to the destruction of everything that Orhan Sahib had built. This was not a temporary alliance or an opportunistic raid. This was a generational grudge being settled. This was revenge for the defeat that Orhan Sahib's grandfather had inflicted. This was a war that would not end with a single battle, that would continue until one side or the other was completely destroyed. Orhan Sahib absorbed this information. He let it settle into his understanding of the situation. He adjusted his plans accordingly. Turhan arrived on the 7th day. He had pushed his men and horses to their limits, leaving a trail of exhausted animals and supplies abandoned by the roadside. But he had arrived, and he had brought most of his force with him, 200 cavalry who were tired but still capable, still ready to fight. Flavius arrived on the 8th day. His diplomatic party had not fared as well on the hard ride. Several horses had collapsed. One man had broken his arm when his mount stumbled, but Flavius himself was intact, and the intelligence he brought was valuable, information gathered from the Byzantine nobles about the Karamanids, about their strength, about their intentions. By the 9th day, Orhan Sahib had assembled what forces he could: Turhan's cavalry, the garrison's soldiers, the recruits, barely trained but willing, a handful of veterans who had been scattered across other duties and had been recalled, Flavius and his diplomatic party, armed and ready to fight rather than negotiate. In total, perhaps 5,000 men, against 20,000. The numbers were not encouraging. But numbers were not everything. Numbers did not account for walls. Numbers did not account for defensive positions. Numbers did not account for desperation, for faith, for the knowledge that there was nowhere to retreat, that everything depended on holding this ground, this city, this moment. The council met on the evening of the 9th day. Every commander was present. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the tension that preceded battles that everyone knew would be decisive. Orhan Sahib stood at the head of the table. He looked at the men who had served him through everything, who had followed him into situations that should have killed them, who had somehow, through skill and faith and the grace of the Almighty, survived. Tomorrow, he said, the enemy will arrive. Tomorrow, we will see their banners on the horizon. Tomorrow, the battle for everything we have built will begin. He paused. The silence was complete. I will not lie to you, he continued. The odds are not in our favor. They outnumber us 4-1. They have been preparing for this moment while we were occupied elsewhere. They have advantages that we cannot ignore. But he leaned forward, his hands on the table, his eyes moving from face to face. But we have advantages as well. We have walls. We have the knowledge of this terrain. We have the faith that we are fighting for something larger than ourselves, something that the Almighty has blessed, something that will not be easily destroyed. And we have each other. He straightened. I have seen what you are capable of. I have stood beside you in battles that should have been lost. I have watched you turn defeat into victory, watched you find strength when strength should have been exhausted, watched you refuse to accept outcomes that seemed inevitable. Tomorrow, I will ask you to do that again. Tomorrow, I will ask you to hold. Not to win, not yet. Winning will come later. Tomorrow, I ask only that you hold, that you stand on these walls and refuse to fall, that you make the enemy pay for every inch of ground they try to take, that you show them what it means to fight men who serve the Almighty, who carry the banner of justice, who will not break because breaking is not in their nature. Hold. That is all I ask. That is all I need. Hold. The commanders looked at him, they looked at each other, and one by one they nodded. They would hold. They would hold because there was no alternative. They would hold because that was what they had always done. They would hold. The council dispersed, the commanders went to their positions, the night deepened. And Orhan Sahib remained in the council chamber, alone with the maps and the candles, and the weight of everything that tomorrow would bring. He did not sleep. Sleep was not possible, not on a night like this, not with everything hanging in the balance. He prayed, he recited the words that connected him to the Almighty, the words that had sustained him through every crisis, every battle, every moment when the world had seemed about to collapse. And when the prayers were finished, he stood at the window and watched the darkness begin to fade, watched the first grey light of dawn creep across the sky, watched the world wake to a day that would determine everything. The Karamanids appeared on the horizon as the sun rose. Their banners were visible first, black with silver markings, just as the scout had described. Then the mass of their army became visible, spreading across the landscape like a dark tide, filling the valley that led to Bursa's gates. 20,000 men, perhaps more. They stopped outside arrow range. They set up their camp with the methodical efficiency of a force that expected to be there for a while. They were in no hurry. They knew they had the advantage. They could afford to wait. Orhan Sahib watched from the walls. Beside him stood Turhan and Flavius and Jarkutai, and all the others, watching the same sight, feeling the same mixture of fear and determination that filled every man who faced overwhelming odds. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The enemy was here. The battle was about to begin. Everything they had built would be tested in the hours and days ahead. A rider emerged from the Karamanid camp. He carried a white flag. He approached the walls slowly, making clear that he came to parley, not to fight. Orhan Sahib descended from the walls. He went to the gate. He ordered it opened, just wide enough for him to step through, just wide enough for the rider to see him clearly. The rider stopped a dozen paces away. He was young, well-dressed, clearly a messenger of some importance. "My Lord Aledin sends greetings," the rider said. "He wishes to inform you that your situation is hopeless. You are outnumbered, you are surrounded, you cannot win." Orhan Sahib said nothing. "My lord offers you terms," the rider continued. "Surrender the city, abdicate your throne, go into exile with your family. In return, your life will be spared, your family will be spared, the city will not be sacked." "These are generous terms," the rider added. "They will not be offered again." Orhan Sahib looked at the rider. He looked past the rider to the vast army spread across the valley. He looked at the banners, black with silver, the banners of his enemies. And then he spoke, and his voice was steady, and his words were clear, and every man on the walls could hear them. "Tell your lord," he said, "that the Osmanlis do not surrender. Tell him that we do not abandon what we have built. Tell him that these walls have been blessed by the Almighty, and that they will not fall to those who seek to destroy what is righteous. Tell him that if he wants this city, he will have to take it. And tell him that the cost of taking it will be higher than he can imagine." The rider stared at him. For a moment his composure wavered. He had expected negotiation. He had expected fear. He had expected anything except this calm, this certainty, this absolute refusal to accept defeat. Then the rider recovered. He nodded. He turned his horse. He rode back toward the Karamanid camp. Orhan Sahib watched him go. Then he turned and walked back through the gate, and the gate closed behind him, and the defenders of Bursa prepared for the assault that would come. The assault came at noon. The Karamanids attacked in waves, thousands of men surging toward the walls, carrying ladders and ropes and siege equipment that they had prepared in the weeks of their march. They came with the confidence of numbers, the confidence of men who believed that victory was inevitable, that the walls would fall as walls always fell when attacked by overwhelming force. They were wrong. The defenders held. They held because they had no choice. They held because Orhan Sahib had asked them to hold, and because refusing to hold was not something they could imagine. They held because the walls were strong, and because the positions had been prepared, and because every man knew exactly where he was supposed to stand and what he was supposed to do. Tarhan commanded the eastern section of the wall. He moved along his position constantly, appearing wherever the pressure was greatest, his sword rising and falling with the mechanical precision that had made him legendary. When a ladder reached the top of the wall, Tarhan was there to push it back. When an enemy soldier gained the parapet, Tarhan was there to meet him. When the men around him began to waver, Tarhan was there with a word, a gesture, a presence that reminded them who they were and what they were fighting for. Flavius commanded the western section. He was everywhere at once, roaring orders, pulling wounded men to safety, grabbing weapons from fallen defenders and throwing them to others who needed them. His section faced the heaviest assault, the main concentration of the Karamanid attack, and under his command it held. Wave after wave crashed against the western wall, and wave after wave was thrown back, leaving the ground beneath the walls carpeted with bodies. Jarkutai commanded the reserves. He waited behind the walls with every man who could be spared from the defensive positions, ready to reinforce any point that seemed about to break. 3 times during that first day, he led his reserves into gaps that had opened in the defense. 3 times, his arrival turned what might have been breakthrough into slaughter for the attackers. And Orhan Sahib moved between all of them. He did not command any single section. He commanded everything, seeing the battle as a whole, understanding how each part connected to every other part, making decisions that shaped the flow of combat in ways that only became apparent hours later. He was everywhere and nowhere. He appeared at the eastern wall just as a Karamanid officer led a charge up a ladder, and his sword took the officer's head before the man had even seen him. He appeared at the western wall just as a section of defenders began to buckle under the pressure, and his voice cut through the chaos with orders that restored their formation. He appeared at the gates just as a battering ram was brought forward, and he organized the response that turned the ram into kindling and its operators into corpses. By nightfall, the first assault had failed. The Karamanids pulled back. They retreated to their camp, leaving their dead beneath the walls, leaving the ground soaked with blood that was not all their own. The defenders had lost men. Not many, compared to the attackers, but each loss was felt, each death leaving a gap in the line that had to be filled by someone who was already exhausted. There would be another assault tomorrow, and another the day after that, and another the day after that. The Karamanids had numbers. They could afford to grind against the walls, spending lives to wear down the defense, waiting for the moment when exhaustion and attrition finally created the opening they needed. Orhan Sahib walked the walls that night. He spoke to every man he passed. He thanked them for their service. He praised their courage. He promised them that their sacrifice was not in vain. And in his heart, he calculated. At this rate, the defense could hold for perhaps a week, perhaps 10 days if they were careful, perhaps 2 weeks if the Almighty blessed them with unusual fortune. But eventually the numbers would tell. Eventually the attackers would find a weakness. Eventually the walls would fall. Unless something changed. Unless some new factor entered the equation. Unless someone somewhere did something that the Karamanids did not expect. Orhan Sahib returned to his command position. He looked at the maps. He looked at the reports. He looked at everything he knew about the enemy, about their commander, about the situation. And somewhere in the darkness of that night, an idea began to form. Not a good idea, not a safe idea, an idea that might be brilliant or might be catastrophic, depending on factors that could not be controlled. But an idea nonetheless. And ideas in desperate situations were sometimes the only weapons that mattered. He called for Tarhan. Tarhan appeared within minutes, his armor still bearing the marks of the day's fighting, his eyes still carrying the intensity that never seemed to fade. "I need you to do something," Orhan Sahib said, "something dangerous, something that might not work, something that I cannot order you to do, only ask." Tarhan looked at him. He did not ask what. He simply said, "I will do it." Orhan Sahib almost smiled. "Of course you will," he said. "That is why I am asking you." He explained the plan. Tarhan listened. His face did not change. He did not express doubt or fear or any of the reactions that a reasonable man might have had to such a proposal. When Orhan Sahib finished, Tarhan simply nodded. "Tonight?" he asked. "Tonight," Orhan Sahib confirmed, "before they have time to prepare, before they expect it, while they are still confident." Tarhan bowed, he turned, he departed. Orhan Sahib watched him go. And then he prayed. He prayed that he had not just sent his most trusted commander to his death. He prayed that the plan would work. He prayed that the Almighty would grant them the victory that they needed. And then he returned to the walls, and he waited, and the night deepened around him. The moon rose, the stars emerged. The Karamanid camp glowed with the light of countless fires, the celebration of an enemy that believed tomorrow would bring them closer to victory. They did not know what was coming. They could not imagine what was coming. And when it came, they would not be ready. That was the plan. That was the hope. That was everything. The hours passed. And then, somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls, the plan began. Tarhan and 50 of his best men had slipped out through a hidden gate on the northern side of the city. They had moved through terrain that they knew and the enemy did not, terrain that Tarhan had scouted personally in the days before the assault. They had circled wide around the Karamanid camp, staying in the shadows, moving with the silence that only years of training could provide. Their target was the supply train. Every army needed supplies: food, water, arrows, replacement weapons, medical supplies. All of it had to be transporting, had to be stored, had to be protected. And the larger the army, the larger the supply train, the more vulnerable it became. The Karamanid supply train was positioned behind the main camp, guarded by a token force of soldiers who had never expected to see combat. It was the obvious weak point, the point that any competent commander would think to protect. But Aledin was confident. Aledin had 20,000 men. Aledin did not believe that the defenders, outnumbered and besieged, would have the audacity to attack his rear. Aledin was about to learn that audacity was not something the Osmanlis lacked. Tarhan reached the supply train shortly after midnight. His men spread out, each one assigned a specific target, each one carrying torches that had been kept dark during the approach. They waited in the shadows, watching the guards, counting the patrols, timing their movements. And then on Tarhan's signal, they struck. The first torch arced through the air and landed in a wagon full of grain. The grain caught immediately, the flames spreading with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. Before the guards could react, more torches followed, landing in supply carts, in weapon stores, in the tents where the reserve food was kept. The supply train erupted into chaos. Guards ran in every direction, trying to extinguish fires that were already out of control. Officers screamed orders that no one could hear over the roar of the flames. Horses broke free from their tethers and fled into the night, adding to the confusion. And through it all, Turhan and his men moved like shadows, striking down anyone who got in their way, adding new fires to the ones already burning, ensuring that the destruction was as complete as possible. They were gone before the main army could respond. They melted back into the darkness, back through the terrain they had mapped, back toward the city that was counting on them. By dawn, the Karamanid supply train was a smoldering ruin. Half their food was gone, most of their medical supplies were gone, a significant portion of their arrows and replacement weapons were gone. An army that had expected to starve out the defenders was suddenly facing the prospect of starving themselves. Aledin stood in the ashes of his supplies, and for the first time since his campaign began, he felt something other than confidence. He felt doubt. And doubt, once it took root, was very hard to remove. On the walls of Bursa, Orhan Sahib watched the smoke rise from the enemy camp. Turhan stood beside him, his armor scorched, his face blackened with soot, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. "They will not attack today," Turhan said. "They cannot. They need time to assess their losses, to decide what to do next." Orhan Sahib nodded, and that time, he said, is time we need. Time for our allies to hear of our situation. Time for other enemies of the Karamanids to see their vulnerability. Time for everything to change. He turned to Turhan. "You have bought us that time," he said. "You and your men, what you did tonight will be remembered for generations." Turhan shook his head. "What I did tonight," he said, "I did because you asked. What I did tonight, I did because you had a plan when everyone else saw only defeat. Remember that when the histories are written. Remember that this was your victory, not mine." Orhan Sahib looked at his most trusted commander. He saw the loyalty there, the devotion, the willingness to give credit to others that would have taken it for himself. "It was our victory," he said, "yours and mine, and it is not over yet." He turned back to the enemy camp. The Karamanids were still there, still numerous, still dangerous. The destruction of their supplies had hurt them, but it had not broken them. They would regroup, they would find new supplies, they would attack again. But they would do so with doubt in their hearts. They would do so knowing that the defenders were not the easy targets they had expected. They would do so wondering what other surprises might be waiting for them. And doubt in warfare was often more powerful than any weapon. The siege continued. But it continued differently now. The Karamanids attacked again on the third day after the supply train raid. They attacked with the fury of men who were angry, who had been humiliated, who wanted revenge. They threw themselves at the walls with an intensity that exceeded anything the defenders had yet seen. And they were thrown back. Again, and again, and again. Each assault cost them more men. Each failure added to the doubt that had taken root in their hearts. Each day that passed without victory made them wonder if victory would ever come. And on the 10th day of the siege, something happened that Orhan Sahib had hoped for but had not dared to expect. Riders appeared on the eastern horizon, not Karamanid riders, different banners, different colors. Allies. The Emirate of Jermian had answered the call. They had heard of the siege. They had seen an opportunity. They had mobilized their forces and marched to join the fight against a common enemy. 5,000 men, fresh, eager, ready to fight. The Karamanids saw them coming. They saw the new banners appearing on the horizon. They saw their numerical advantage evaporating. And Aledin, standing in his command tent, made a decision. He ordered the retreat. The siege was lifted. The Karamanid army withdrew, pulling back toward the mountains they had come from, abandoning the campaign that had been meant to destroy the Osmanli Sultanate. They were not destroyed, they would rebuild, they would return, but not today, not this year, perhaps not for many years. Today they had failed. Today the walls of Bursa had held. Today Orhan Sahib had won. The celebrations were muted. There was too much exhaustion for true celebration, too many dead to bury, too much damage to repair, too much awareness that the victory, while real, was not final, that the enemies were still out there, still planning, still waiting. But there was relief, there was gratitude, there was the profound satisfaction of having faced annihilation and survived. Orhan Sahib stood on the walls as the last of the Karamanid forces disappeared over the horizon. He stood alone, watching them go, feeling the weight of everything that had happened over the past weeks. Turhan joined him, then Flavius, then Jarkutai. The commanders gathered around their sultan and they stood in silence, sharing the moment. "It is not over," Orhan Sahib said finally. "No," Turhan agreed, "it is not over." It will never be over, Flavius added. There will always be another enemy, another threat, another crisis.
Orhan Sahib nodded.
Then we will always be ready, he said. We will always be prepared. We will always stand on these walls, no matter how many times we are asked to stand.
He turned to face his commanders.
And we will always remember, he said, that we did not stand alone. We stood together. We stood with each other. We stood with the Almighty.
And that is why we won.
That is why we will always win. The commanders looked at him, they looked at each other, and one by one they nodded. They would remember. They would always remember. And the story would continue. As it always did. As it always would. Until the last word was written. And perhaps not even then. The sun set over Bursa, the stars emerged. The clouds that had hung over the land for weeks finally broke, and rain fell, washing the blood from the walls, nourishing the earth that had drunk so much death. The rain fell and the world was cleansed, and the future waited. Always waiting. Always ready for the next chapter. Always, the morning came not with the gentle light of peace, but with the grey heaviness of a sky that had forgotten how to be bright. The clouds hung low over Bursa, pressing down upon the minarets and the rooftops and the streets where the merchants were already setting out their wares, where the children were already running with messages and errands, where life continued its stubborn march forward regardless of what had happened yesterday or what might happen tomorrow.
Orhan Sahib had not slept.
He had tried, he had lain on the cushions in his chamber and closed his eyes and willed his body to rest. But the body had refused, the mind had refused. Every time the darkness of sleep approached, it brought with it the faces of the dead, the sounds of the battlefield, the weight of decisions that could not be undone. And so he had risen, he had dressed, he had gone to the window and watched the city wake beneath him, and he had thought about what came next. What always came next? The summons went out before the first call to prayer had finished echoing from the minarets. Orhan received his in the barracks, where he had been inspecting the equipment of the new recruits, running his fingers along sword edges and testing the straps of armor, and saying nothing, but communicating everything through the particular quality of his silence. Flavius received his in the quarters that had been assigned to him, where he had been sitting alone with a cup of water that had gone warm hours ago, staring at the wall and seeing things that the wall could not show. Jakutai received his in the stables, where he had been tending to his horse with a gentleness that seemed impossible in a man who had killed so many, brushing the animal's coat and whispering words that only the horse could hear. They came, they always came. They gathered in the council chamber where the maps had been spread across the great table, where the candles had been lit against the grey morning light, where the air smelled of ink and old parchment, and the particular tension that preceded every major campaign. Orhan Sahib stood at the head of the table. He did not sit, he never sat during these meetings. Standing allowed him to move, to pace, to let his body process the energy that his mind generated. He looked at each of his commanders in turn, measuring them, assessing them, seeing in their faces the same exhaustion that he felt in his own bones. The Byzantine frontier is quiet, he said. His voice was low, almost conversational, but it carried to every corner of the room. Shahanshah is exiled. Yakid is dead. The enemies we have been fighting for the past year have been defeated or scattered. By all measures, this should be a time of rest.
He paused, the silence stretched.
But rest is a luxury that empires cannot afford, he continued. The moment we pause, the moment we stop building, the moment we allow ourselves to believe that the work is finished, that is the moment when the foundation begins to crack. There are fortresses on the western border that remain in Byzantine hands. There are trade routes that are not yet secure. There are alliances that have been promised but not yet sealed. There are enemies watching us, waiting for any sign of weakness. He placed his hand on the map, fingers spread across the terrain that marked the next phase of their expansion. We do not give them that sign. Flavius spoke first. His voice was hoarse, not from shouting orders but from something deeper, something that had settled in his throat during the long weeks of hunting Yakid and had not yet cleared. The men are tired, he said, not complaining, not refusing, but tired. The campaign against Shahanshah pushed them to their limits. The pursuit of Yakid pushed them further. If we march again without rest, we risk breaking something that cannot be easily repaired. Orhan Sahib nodded. He had expected this. He had been waiting for someone to say it so that he could address it directly. I know, he said, I know what I am asking. I know what it costs, but consider the alternative. We rest. We let the men recover for a month, 2 months, 3. And in that time, what happens? The Byzantines regroup. Their nobles choose a new leader to rally behind. The fortresses on our border receive reinforcements. The trade routes we need remain closed. The opportunity we have now, the opportunity that Shahanshah's defeat has created, that opportunity closes. He looked at Flavius. I am not asking for another campaign like the last one, he said. I am not asking for another war that will cost us thousands of lives and months of fighting. I am asking for a series of targeted operations, swift strikes against isolated positions, diplomatic missions backed by the threat of force, the application of pressure at key points until the entire structure begins to give way. He turned to Orhan. You will lead the advance force, he said, 200 of our best cavalry. You will move along the western road, making our presence known. You will not engage unless engaged. You will be a warning, a reminder, a promise of what will come if our terms are not accepted. Orhan nodded. He did not ask questions. He did not require explanations. Orhan Sahib had given him his role, and he would execute it with the same precision that he brought to everything. Flavius, Orhan Sahib continued, you will take command of the diplomatic mission. You will approach the Byzantine nobles who have not yet declared for any faction. You will offer them terms, generous terms, terms that will make them question whether resistance is worth the cost. And behind those terms, you will have the authority to promise consequences if the terms are refused. Flavius allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Diplomacy backed by the threat of annihilation, he said, my favorite kind. Orhan Sahib did not smile. There would be time for smiles later. There would be time for celebration and rest, and all the things that victory was supposed to bring, but not now. Now there was only the work. Jakutai, he said, turning to the veteran commander, you will remain here. You will oversee the training of the new recruits. You will ensure that the garrison is strong enough to defend Bursa in our absence. You will be my eyes and ears in this city, watching for any sign of treachery, any hint of conspiracy, any movement that suggests that our enemies have not all been defeated. Jakutai bowed his head. He understood. He was being asked to stay behind, to guard what had been won rather than to participate in what was being built. It was a role that some commanders would have resented, but Jakutai was not some commanders. He understood that the fortress that is not defended is a fortress that is already lost, that the home front mattered as much as the front lines, that the work of a warrior did not end when the last battle did. I will not fail you, he said. Orhan Sahib looked at him. I know, he said, I have never doubted it. The meeting continued. Details were discussed. Supply lines were mapped. Contingencies were planned for every possibility that could be anticipated and some that could not. The grey morning light strengthened slowly, the clouds thinning, the sun beginning to force its way through, and by the time the meeting ended, the day had arrived in full, bringing with it the promise of movement, of action, of the continuation of the endless work that empire required. The commanders dispersed. Orhan went to gather his cavalry. Flavius went to prepare his diplomatic documents. Jakutai went to inspect the garrison and begin the long work of turning raw recruits into the kind of soldiers who could hold a city against anything. And Orhan Sahib remained in the council chamber, alone with the maps and the candles and the weight of everything that rested on his shoulders. A knock at the door. He turned. A Sporka stood in the doorway. She had changed since those first days after her return from the monastery. The change was subtle, visible only to those who had known her before, but it was real. The way she held herself had shifted. The uncertainty that had clouded her eyes had begun to clear. She walked into the room with the deliberate grace of a woman who had decided to claim her space rather than hide from it. I heard there was a meeting, she said. I heard there are new campaigns being planned. Orhan Sahib studied her. He had not invited her to the council. He had not expected her to come. The councils were for commanders, for men who had earned their places through years of service and sacrifice. But a Sporka was learning. A Sporka was watching. A Sporka was becoming something that the older Sporka could never have imagined. He said, there is much work to do. A Sporka approached the table. She looked at the maps. She did not pretend to understand everything she saw, but she looked, and her eyes moved across the terrain with the focus of someone who was trying to learn rather than someone who was merely observing. You are sending Orhan to the west, she said, a show of force. You are sending Flavius to negotiate, a show of restraint. You are keeping Jakutai here to guard what you have built, a show of wisdom. Orhan Sahib raised an eyebrow. You have been paying attention, he said. I have been learning, she answered, as you instructed, as I promised I would. She met his gaze directly. There was no flinching in her eyes, no looking away. She had decided that she would face him as an equal, or as close to an equal as circumstances allowed, and she would not retreat from that decision. I want to understand, she said. I want to understand how you think. I want to understand why you make the decisions you make. Not because I intend to question them. Not because I imagine that I know better. But because if I am to be your wife, if I am to be the mother of your children, If I am to be part of this dynasty that you are building, then I need to understand what that dynasty rests upon. Orhan Sahib was silent for a moment. He looked at this woman who had been given to him as a diplomatic prize, who had fled from him to a monastery, who had been dragged back into his world by force and necessity, and who was now standing before him offering something that he had not expected and could not easily dismiss. Partnership. Not love, not yet, perhaps not ever. The relationship between them was too complicated, too shaped by circumstances beyond their control for anything as simple as love, but partnership. The willingness to work together toward a common goal. The recognition that they were bound by forces larger than themselves, and that their only choice was whether to resist those forces or harness them. Sit, he said, gesturing to a chair at the edge of the table. I will explain. And so he did. He explained the strategic situation, the weakness of the Byzantines and how that weakness could be exploited, the danger of moving too quickly and the greater danger of moving too slowly, the importance of showing strength without provoking a coalition of enemies, the delicate balance between expansion and consolidation. Asporka listened. She asked questions that revealed she was not merely listening but processing, connecting, building a picture in her mind that might one day be useful. She did not interrupt unnecessarily. She did not try to impress him with clever observations. She simply learned. The morning passed, the candles burned down. Servants came and went, bringing food and drink that neither of them touched, taking away the remains of earlier refreshments. And by the time the midday call to prayer echoed from the minarets, something had shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be marked on a calendar or recorded in a chronicle, but something. A foundation had been laid. And foundations, however invisible they might be, were what everything else rested upon. Elsewhere in the palace, Niloufar was facing her own challenges. She had watched Asporka enter the council chamber. She had stood in a corridor, hidden by shadows, and she had seen the Byzantine princess walk into a room that Niloufar herself had never been invited to enter. She had watched Asporka close the door behind her, and she had felt something twist in her chest, something that was part jealousy and part fear, and part a slow-burning anger that she did not know how to extinguish. It was not fair. She knew it was not fair even as she felt it. Asporka was not to blame for being beautiful. Asporka was not to blame for being useful to the diplomatic ambitions of the Sultanate. Asporka was not to blame for the attention that Orhan Sahib gave her, attention that was motivated as much by politics as by any personal feeling. But fairness and feeling did not always align, and Niloufar was tired of being the first wife who was increasingly treated as the lesser one, tired of watching others receive what she had once taken for granted, tired of the whispers and the looks and the constant, exhausting work of pretending that nothing was wrong. She went to her mother. Malhun was in the garden, tending to the roses that she had planted years ago, roses that had grown into a tangle of thorns and petals that seemed to reflect the complexity of the life that had grown up around them. She did not look up when Niloufar approached, but she knew. Mothers always knew. You have been watching again, Malhun said. Her voice was gentle but not indulgent. Niloufar did not deny it. She sat on the bench beside her mother's work, and she looked at the roses, and she tried to find the words for what she was feeling. She went to the council, Niloufar said. He let her into the council chamber. He has never let me into the council chamber. Malhun continued her work, her fingers moving among the thorns with the practiced ease of long experience. And what would you have done in the council chamber, she asked. What strategies would you have proposed? What deployments would you have questioned? What knowledge would you have brought that the commanders did not already possess? Niloufar was silent. The question was not cruel, but it cut anyway. I could learn, she said finally, as she is learning. Malhun stopped her work. She turned to face her daughter, and her eyes were kind but unflinching. Yes, she said, you could learn. You could have learned years ago. You could have asked to understand the maps, the strategies, the mechanisms of power that your husband wields, but you did not ask. You were content to be the wife, the mother, the keeper of the domestic sphere. You made that choice. It was not a wrong choice. Many women have made it and have been happy, but it was a choice. And now you see another woman making a different choice, and you resent her for it. Niloufar felt tears threatening, and she blinked them back. It is not just about the council, she said. It is about everything. The way he looks at her, the way he speaks to her, the way he rode all the way to a monastery to bring her back when he could have sent anyone. Malhun nodded. She did not dismiss the pain. She did not minimize it. She acknowledged it with the gravity that it deserved. Love is not a finite resource, she said. When your husband gives attention to another, he is not taking it from you. He is giving what he has to give. The question is not whether he loves her. The question is whether his love for her diminishes his love for you.
and that, my daughter, is a question that only time can answer." She reached out and took Nilofar's hand. "But here is what I know," she continued. "You are his first wife, you are the mother of his heirs, you have stood beside him through campaigns and crises that would have broken lesser partnerships. That does not disappear because a new wife enters the household. It cannot be erased by political marriages or diplomatic necessities. It is written into the foundations of this dynasty, and foundations, however much the world might shake, do not easily crumble." Nilofar held her mother's hand. She did not feel entirely comforted. The pain was still there, throbbing beneath the surface of her composure, but she felt less alone. And sometimes, in the midst of trials, feeling less alone was the only comfort available. Meanwhile, far from the palace, Tarhan and his cavalry were already on the move. They had departed within hours of the council ending. 200 riders, the best of the Osmanli cavalry, mounted on horses that had been bred for speed and endurance, armed with weapons that had been forged specifically for the kind of swift, decisive actions that Orhan Sahib had described. They moved along the western road with the efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before, who knew how to travel fast without exhausting their mounts, who knew how to remain alert without burning through their reserves of attention. Tarhan rode at the front. He always rode at the front, not because it was the safest place, which it was not, but because his men needed to see him there, needed to know that whatever dangers they faced, their commander faced them first. His eyes scanned the terrain constantly, reading the landscape the way a scholar reads a text, looking for threats, for opportunities, for anything that deviated from the expected pattern. The western road was not secure. It ran through territory that had technically been conquered, but that had not been fully pacified. There were villages along its length that paid tribute to the Osmanli Sultanate, but that harbored sympathies for the old Byzantine order. There were forests where bandits and remnants of defeated armies might be hiding. There were a dozen places where an ambush could be laid by anyone with enough men and enough desperation. Tarhan welcomed the danger, not because he enjoyed it, not because he sought glory, but because danger was clarity. When the possibility of death was present, all the complications of life fell away. There was only the moment, only the next breath, only the choice between action and inaction, survival and defeat. They made camp the first night beside a river whose name Tarhan did not know or care about. The water was clean, the ground was defensible, and the trees provided cover from observation while still allowing clear sightlines in all directions. The men set up their tents with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. Guards were posted. Fires were lit, small and contained, enough for warmth and cooking, but not enough to serve as beacons for enemies. Tarhan walked the perimeter. He checked every guard post. He exchanged words with every sentry. He made sure that each man knew that he was seen, that he was valued, that his vigilance mattered. This was the work of command that never appeared in the chronicles, the invisible labor that kept armies functioning, that maintained morale when exhaustion and fear threatened to erode it. When the perimeter was secure, Tarhan returned to his own tent. He did not sleep. He sat in the darkness and he thought about what lay ahead. The fortresses on the western border were not heavily defended. Shahanshah's defeat had stripped them of the reinforcements they might have received. Their garrisons were demoralized, uncertain of their future, waiting to see which way the winds of power would blow. If Tarhan could reach them before they made any decisions, if he could present them with the reality of Osmanli strength before they had time to imagine alternatives, they might surrender without a fight. That was the best outcome. That was the outcome Orhan Sahib hoped for. But Tarhan had learned long ago not to expect the best outcome. He had learned to plan for the worst, and to be pleasantly surprised when it did not materialize. And so he sat in the darkness, and he checked his weapons, and he thought about all the ways that the next few days might unfold, and he prepared himself for every one of them. Morning came, the camp was broken, the march resumed. By midday, they reached the first of the fortresses. It was not large, a stone tower surrounded by a wooden palisade, positioned to control a crossroads that linked the western territories to the Byzantine heartland. It was the kind of position that mattered not for what it was, but for what it represented, for the control it exercised over movement and trade and information. Tarhan called a halt outside arrow range. He surveyed the fortress with the practiced eye of a man who had seen hundreds of such positions, who could calculate their strengths and weaknesses in a glance. The tower was solid, but the palisade was in poor repair. The garrison, from what he could see, was small, perhaps 50 men, their movements slow and uncertain. They had seen his cavalry approaching, and they were trying to decide what to do about it. "Send a rider," Tarhan ordered. He looked at the young man beside him, one of the newer additions to his force, eager and untested. "You will approach under flag of truce. You will inform the garrison commander that Sultan Orhan Sahib offers them terms. Surrender the fortress. Open the roads. Acknowledge Osmanli authority.
In return, they will be allowed to depart unharmed with their personal possessions to any destination they choose. Refusal will result in siege, assault, and the consequences that follow assault. The young rider nodded. He was nervous, but he hid it well. He took the flag that was handed to him, white cloth on a wooden pole, and he rode toward the fortress at a pace that was neither too fast nor too slow. Orhan watched, his hand rested on his sword hilt. Not because he expected treachery, not yet, but because resting his hand there had become a habit, a physical reminder of the reality that underlay all negotiations. The rider reached the gates. He called out. The gates remained closed, but a face appeared above the palisade, and a conversation began, too distant for Orhan to hear but visible in the gestures, in the body language, in the back and forth that characterized all such negotiations. Minutes passed, the sun moved overhead. The cavalry waited with the patience of men who had learned that waiting was as much a part of warfare as fighting. And then the gates opened. The garrison commander emerged. He was an older man, his armor bearing the marks of years of service, his face wearing the expression of someone who had weighed his options and found them all wanting. He walked toward Orhan with the slow, deliberate steps of a man approaching his own surrender. Orhan dismounted. He met the commander halfway, in the neutral ground between the fortress and the cavalry. "You are the Osmanli commander," the garrison commander said. It was not a question. "I am," Orhan replied. The garrison commander looked back at his fortress, at the men watching from the walls, at the position he had held for years and that he was about to give up. "We have received no reinforcements," he said. "We have received no supplies. We have received no orders from Constantinople or anywhere else. We have been forgotten, abandoned, left to hold a position that no one cares about anymore." He turned back to Orhan. "Your terms are accepted," he said. "We will depart. We will take nothing but what we carried when we arrived. The fortress is yours." Orhan nodded. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. He simply nodded, acknowledging the surrender with the respect that one professional offered to another. "You have chosen wisely," he said. "Your men will not be harmed. You have my word." The garrison commander looked at him for a long moment, searching for deception, for hidden cruelty, for any sign that the words were not genuine. He found nothing. "Perhaps," he said, "your empire will last longer than mine." He turned and walked back to his fortress to begin the process of evacuation. Orhan watched him go. He thought about empires, about how they rose and fell, about how the men who built them rarely saw them completed, and the men who inherited them rarely understood what they had been given. He did not share these thoughts with anyone. He simply remounted his horse and prepared to enter a fortress that had been won without a single blow being struck. This was victory. This was the best kind of victory, the kind that preserved strength rather than consuming it, the kind that added to resources rather than depleting them, the kind that demonstrated power without the devastating cost of exercising it. One fortress down, more to go. The march continued. Back in Bursa, Flavius was preparing for a different kind of campaign. He had gathered his diplomatic party, a dozen men, chosen not for their fighting skills, though they possessed those in abundance, but for their ability to present the face of Osmanli civilization to those who knew only the face of Osmanli war. They were dressed in their finest garments, clothing that had been cleaned and pressed and chosen specifically to communicate wealth and power and the confidence that came from both. Flavius himself had traded his battlefield armor for a robe of deep blue silk, embroidered with gold thread in patterns that suggested authority without ostentation. His sword remained at his side, because a diplomat without a sword was a diplomat without credibility, but it was a ceremonial weapon, its scabbard decorated, its presence a symbol rather than a threat. He reviewed his objectives. The Byzantine nobles he was approaching were a diverse group, each with their own interests, their own grievances, their own calculations about where their future lay. Some had been loyal to Shahanshah, some had opposed him. Some had simply tried to survive, keeping their heads down, avoiding commitment to any faction, waiting to see who would emerge victorious before choosing their side. These were the most important targets, the ones who had not yet decided, the ones who could be persuaded. Flavius knew how to persuade. He had been doing it his entire life, though in the past his persuasion had often been delivered at the point of a sword. This was different. This required subtlety. This required understanding what each noble wanted and finding a way to align those wants with the interests of the Osmanli Sultanate. It was more difficult than fighting, but it was also more satisfying, because when you convinced someone to join you willingly, they stayed joined. They did not wait for the first opportunity to betray. They did not harbor resentments that festered into future rebellions.
They became, if not friends, at least reliable partners in the great enterprise of building something lasting. The diplomatic party departed in the late afternoon, travelling not by the western road that Orhan had taken, but by the northern route, toward the estates of the Byzantine nobility that dotted the fertile lands between the mountains and the sea. The first estate they reached belonged to a man named Konstantinos. He was middle-aged, wealthy, cautious. He had supported Shahanshah with money but never with men, always maintaining enough distance to claim neutrality if the winds shifted. Now the winds had shifted, and Konstantinos was trying to determine what that meant for his future. Flavius presented himself at the gates of Konstantinos' villa with all the ceremony that the occasion demanded. He sent ahead his credentials. He waited while servants scurried and messages were exchanged. He maintained the patient demeanor of a man who had all the time in the world, even though he knew that time was precisely what he did not have. Eventually, the gates opened. Konstantinos himself emerged to greet his visitor. He was shorter than Flavius had expected, with the soft body of a man who had never lifted anything heavier than a wine cup. But his eyes were sharp, calculating, the eyes of someone who had survived decades of Byzantine politics by being smarter than everyone around him. Flavius, Konstantinos said, and the name came out like an assessment, the Osmanli warrior who burns his enemies and negotiates with everyone else. I have heard stories about you. Flavius smiled. I hope they were entertaining stories, he said. The truth is usually less dramatic. Konstantinos gestured toward the villa. Please, enter. Let us discuss what brings you to my door. They went inside. The villa was impressive, filled with treasures accumulated over generations, art and furniture and books that spoke of wealth and culture, and the kind of civilization that the Byzantines believed set them apart from the rest of the world. Flavius noted everything. He noted the servants and their positions. He noted the doors and where they led. He noted the quality of the wine that was poured for him and the particular way that Konstantinos held his cup. All of it was information. All of it was useful. The conversation began with pleasantries. The weather, the journey, the beauty of the villa, the predictable dance of two men circling each other looking for openings. Then Flavius moved to the substance. You know why I am here, he said. Sultan Orhan Sahib offers friendship to those who are willing to accept it. Friendship that comes with trade, protection, the opportunity to be part of something larger than any individual estate or any individual fortune. Konstantinos sipped his wine. And what does this friendship cost? He asked. Acknowledgement, Flavius replied. Public acknowledgement that the Osmanli Sultanate is the legitimate authority in this region. Support when support is requested. Information when information is needed. In return, your lands remain yours. Your wealth remains yours. Your freedom to worship as you choose remains yours. We ask only for cooperation. Konstantinos was silent for a moment. He was thinking, calculating, weighing the risks of acceptance against the risks of refusal. And if I decline this generous offer, he asked. Flavius's smile did not waver, but something in his eyes hardened. Then you would be making a choice, he said, a choice to stand against the tide of history, a choice that would have consequences, not today, not tomorrow, but eventually, because the Osmanli Sultanate is patient, we do not forget, and we do not leave loose ends. The threat was delivered gently, almost apologetically, but it was unmistakably a threat. Konstantinos understood. He was not a fool. He had not survived this long by being a fool. I will need time to consider, he said. Of course, Flavius agreed. Take whatever time you need. I will be in the region for several weeks. When you have reached your decision, send word. I will return to hear it. He stood. He bowed with exactly the right degree of respect. He departed with exactly the right amount of ceremony. And as he rode away from the villa, he thought about Konstantinos and all the Konstantinoses that dotted this landscape, all the cautious men waiting to see which way the wind would blow before committing themselves. They would commit, they always committed, eventually, because the wind was blowing and it was blowing in only one direction. The day passed, the night came. The stars emerged, the same stars that had watched over Bursa, the same stars that had watched over the battlefield where Shahanshah had been defeated, the same stars that had watched over the ravine where Yakid had died. And beneath those stars, in tents and villas and palaces and hovels, men and women slept and dreamed and woke, and continued the endless work of living. The work of building. The work of destroying. The work that never ended. In Bursa, Orhan Sahib sat with reports that had arrived by the evening messenger. The first fortress had fallen. Tarhin was advancing. Flavius had begun his diplomatic circuit. Jarkutai reported that the garrison was strong and that the new recruits were progressing well. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But Orhan Sahib had learned not to trust plans. He had learned that the world had a way of introducing variables that no planning could anticipate. He had learned that confidence was necessary, but that overconfidence was fatal. He set the reports aside. He rose from his chair. He went to the window and looked out at the city that was the heart of everything he was building. It was quiet, the streets were empty, the shops were closed, the world was sleeping. But the world would wake, and when it woke, it would present new challenges, new obstacles, new opportunities. Orhan Sahib was ready. He had been ready for years. He would be ready for years more. Because that was what it meant to be a sultan. That was what it meant to carry a vision that was larger than any single life. You did not rest. You did not pause. You did not allow yourself the luxury of believing that the work was finished. The work was never finished. The story was never finished. It simply continued, chapter after chapter, generation after generation, until it became something that transcended any individual, that belonged to history itself. And history, whatever else might be said about it, was patient. It could wait. It always waited. And Orhan Sahib, servant of the Almighty, builder of empires, walker between worlds, understood that patience better than most. He returned to his chair. He picked up the reports again. He began to plan for the next day. And outside the window, the stars continued to watch. They would watch for a long time. They had nothing but time. And the story they were watching was just beginning. Always beginning. Always reaching for the next chapter. Always. The wind shifted, the clouds began to gather again. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, the promise of storms to come. But storms passed. Empires endured. Or tried to endure. That was the only question that mattered. Would this one endure? The answer was being written. Word by word. Deed by deed. Life by life. And the writing was far from finished. Far from finished. The night deepened. The palace slept. The world waited. And the story continued. As it always did. As it always would. Until the last word was written. And perhaps not even then. Perhaps not even then. The thunder came closer. And then it passed. And the silence that followed was not the silence of ending. It was the silence of preparation. Of gathering. Of waiting for the next chapter to begin. And the next chapter was always coming. Always. Always the dust had not settled. It would not settle for days, perhaps weeks, perhaps longer. The earth itself seemed to reject stillness, as though the blood that had been poured into it had given it a restless energy, a hunger that demanded more, always more. And Orhan Sahib stood at the center of that hunger, his blade still drawn, his armor streaked with the evidence of what he had done, and what he had survived, his eyes scanning the field where the bodies of enemies and brothers lay intertwined in the final embrace that battle forces upon all men, regardless of which side they chose. The first charge had broken Shahanshah's left flank. Tarhin had led it, as Tarhin always led the charges that required precision rather than mere force, and he had cut through the Byzantine line like a needle through cloth, finding the weak points, the gaps where fear had created distance between shields, the moments where hesitation had replaced discipline. Behind him rode the men who had sworn themselves to the Osmanli cause not for gold, but for glory, not for land, but for legacy, and they poured through the gaps that Tarhin created with the inevitability of water, finding its way downhill. But Shahanshah had not survived decades of court intrigue and military catastrophe by being predictable. His center held, his right flank counterattacked, and suddenly the battle that had seemed moments from victory became something else entirely, became a grinding, brutal contest of endurance where every yard of ground was purchased with lives, and every advantage was temporary, and every breath might be the last. Orhan Sahib fought in the center because the center was where the battle would be decided. He fought beside Flavius, the two of them moving in a coordination that required no words, no signals, only the deep understanding that comes from having faced death together so many times that death had become familiar, almost boring, a guest that kept arriving at the door and kept being turned away. Flavius took the left. Orhan Sahib took the right. Between them, they created a space where no enemy could stand, a zone of steel and fury that expanded with every stroke, pushing the Byzantine line backward step by bloody step. But the Byzantine line was deep, and behind it, directing it, orchestrating it with the cold precision of a man who had nothing left to lose, Shahanshah sat on his horse and watched and waited and calculated. He had sent Damia Khan to the right flank with orders that were simple and brutal. Break through. Find Orhan Sahib's command tent, burn it, kill everyone inside. It did not matter if Orhan Sahib himself was on the field. What mattered was the symbol, the tent, the banner, the physical manifestation of Osmanli authority. Destroy that, and the men who fought for it would feel the destruction in their hearts, would hesitate, would wonder, and in battle, hesitation and wonder were the same as death. Damia Khan rode with 500 men. They swept wide around the battlefield, using the terrain that Shahanshah's scouts had mapped weeks before, following paths that the Osmanli patrols had not found because they had not looked for them, because they had been too focused on the enemy in front of them to worry about the enemy that might circle behind. But Jalkutai had worried. Jalkutai, who had wept at Burhan's grave and then dried his tears and transformed his grief into a vigilance that bordered on obsession, had posted riders on every ridge, every hill, every elevation that offered a view of the approaches to the camp. And when Damia Khan's force appeared on the western horizon, moving fast, moving with purpose, those riders lit the signal fires that Jalkutai had prepared, and the smoke rose into the grey sky, and Jalkutai saw it, and he understood. He did not ask permission. There was no time. He gathered the reserve cavalry, 300 men who had been held back for exactly this kind of moment, and he rode to intercept Damia Khan before Damia Khan could reach the camp. They met in a narrow valley between two hills. The terrain favored neither side. The ground was rocky, uneven, scattered with boulders that forced the horses to slow, that broke up formations, that turned what should have been a cavalry engagement into something closer to a brawl. Jalkutai did not care. He had been in brawls before. He had won them. His lance found the first of Damia Khan's riders before the man even knew he was under attack. The impact threw the rider from his horse and sent both of them tumbling across the rocks in a tangle of limbs and leather and steel. Jalkutai did not watch them fall. He was already moving to the next target, his lance reversed now, used as a club, the shaft cracking against helmets and shoulders, and the exposed faces of men who had not raised their guards in time. The valley became a slaughterhouse. Neither side could retreat, neither side could advance. They simply clashed and fell and rose and clashed again, and the rocks beneath them turned slick with blood, and the horses screamed with the particular terror of animals who understand that they are dying but cannot understand why. Damia Khan found Jalkutai in the chaos. Or perhaps Jalkutai found him. It did not matter. What mattered was that they faced each other across a space of perhaps 10 feet, their horses pawing the ground, their weapons drawn, their eyes locked in the particular recognition that passes between men who know that only one of them will ride away from this place. Jalkutai spoke first. You ride for a dead cause, he said. Shahanshah has already lost. He lost the moment he raised his hand against the servants of the Almighty. Everything that follows is merely the world catching up to what has already been decided. Damia Khan laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had stopped believing in anything except the next breath, the next blow, the next moment of survival. Decided by whom, he asked. By your god. Your god seems to be losing as many men as mine. Jalkutai's face did not change. He simply raised his sword and charged. The fight between them lasted longer than it should have. Damia Khan was skilled, hardened by years of border warfare, trained in the Byzantine style that emphasized defense and counterattack, waiting for the enemy to overextend and then punishing every mistake. Jalkutai was as manly, trained in the style that emphasized relentless pressure, constant movement, never allowing the enemy a moment to recover, a moment to think, a moment to believe that he might survive. Their blades met again and again. Sparks flew, horses circled. The men around them continued to fight and die, but the two commanders existed in their own world, a world that contained nothing but each other and the steel between them. Jalkutai took a cut across his forearm. The wound was shallow, but it bled freely, and the blood made his grip slippery, made every stroke require more concentration than it should have. Damia Khan pressed the advantage, driving forward, his blade seeking the gaps in Jalkutai's guard, finding one, finding another, each strike coming closer to something vital. But Jalkutai had been wounded before. He had fought through worse. He had learned in the long years of serving the Osmanli cause that pain was simply information, that blood was simply a resource, that the body would continue to function long after the mind had concluded that function was impossible. He ignored the wound. He ignored the blood. He focused only on Damia Khan's eyes because the eyes always betrayed the next move, always shifted a fraction of a moment before the blade followed. He saw it, the shift, the slight widening that preceded a committed strike. Damia Khan was going for the throat. It was a good choice. a killing blow, the kind of blow that ends fights and ends wars and ends everything. Jarkutai dropped. Not backward, not to the side. Down, he slumped in his saddle as though he had finally succumbed to his wounds, and Damir Khan's blade swept through the air where his throat had been a moment before, and the momentum of that strike carried Damir Khan forward just slightly, just enough, and Jarkutai rose with his own blade extended and drove it upward under Damir Khan's arm, where the armor was weakest, where the flesh was softest, where the heart waited like a traitor inside its cage of bone. Damir Khan's eyes went wide, not with pain, not with fear, with surprise. The particular surprise of a man who has spent his entire life believing himself to be the protagonist of his own story and has just discovered in the final moment that he was merely a supporting character in someone else's. He fell from his horse, he did not rise. The Byzantine force broke. Without their commander, without the focus that his presence provided, they scattered across the valley, seeking escape routes that did not exist, finding only the blades of Jarkutai's men waiting for them. A few surrendered, most did not have the chance. The Osmanli cavalry swept through them like fire through dry grass, and when it was over, when the valley had gone quiet except for the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of exhausted horses, Jarkutai sat motionless in his saddle and looked at the destruction and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just exhaustion, just the bone-deep weariness of a man who had done what needed to be done and understood that there would be more that needed to be done tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until either he was dead or the cause he served had been secured beyond the reach of any enemy. He turned his horse toward the main battlefield. There was still fighting to do. Meanwhile, on that main battlefield, Orhan Sahib had reached the Byzantine command position. It had not been easy. The path had been paved with bodies, some of them wearing Osmanli colors, too many of them young, too many of them men who should have had decades left to live but who had given those decades to this day, to this moment, to the vision that Orhan Sahib carried and that they had chosen to share. Flavius was beside him. Turhan was somewhere to the left, his sword rising and falling with the mechanical precision of a mill wheel, each stroke ending a life, each life ending a threat. Abdul Rahman was down. He had taken a spear through the thigh and was being carried from the field by two of his men, his face grey with blood loss, his lips moving in prayers that might have been for himself or might have been for the men he was leaving behind to fight without him. Tamir Boga had lost his shield but not his sword, and he fought with both hands now, the blade seeming to dance in his grip, describing arcs of steel that left patterns in the air like calligraphy written in light. Shahanshah saw Orhan Sahib coming. He had been watching the battle from his elevated position, directing his forces with the detachment of a man who believed himself too valuable to risk in direct combat. But now that detachment was dissolving. Now the enemy was approaching his position. Now the theoretical danger was becoming actual, immediate, impossible to delegate. He could have fled, the thought occurred to him. The path behind him was clear. His personal guard was intact. He could have ridden away, regrouped, fought another day, preserved himself for a future that might still hold victory. But something in him refused. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was the accumulated humiliations of a reign that had been defined more by what he had lost than by what he had built. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that fleeing now would mean fleeing forever, that his allies would abandon him, that his enemies would mock him, that his name would become a synonym for cowardice in a world where cowardice was the one unforgivable sin. He drew his sword. He rode forward to meet Orhan Sahib. They met at the top of a small rise, a patch of ground that had somehow remained clear of bodies, as though the battle itself had reserved this space for this moment. Their horses faced each other across perhaps 20 feet of churned earth. Their men fell back, not out of any formal agreement, but out of the instinctive understanding that what was about to happen was not for them to interfere with. Shahanshah spoke first. His voice was steady, almost conversational, as though they were meeting over wine rather than over drawn blades. "So here we are," he said, "the Sultan and the Emperor, the upstart and the inheritor. Tell me, Orhan, when you imagine the future, when you close your eyes and see the world as you wish it to be, what do you see? Cities flying your banner, mosques rising where churches stood, generations of your descendants ruling over the ashes of my civilization." Orhan Sahib did not answer immediately. He studied Shahanshah with the same attention he would have given to a map, looking for weaknesses, for tells, for any indication of what the next moment would bring. Then he spoke, and his voice was not steady. It was something beyond steady. It was certain. "I see justice," he said. "I see a world where the strong do not prey upon the weak simply because they can. I see merchants traveling roads without fear of bandits, because those roads are protected by men who serve a higher purpose than their own enrichment. I see farmers keeping the harvest they grow, instead of surrendering it to lords who have never held a plough. I see children learning to read the words of the Almighty, instead of learning to bow before idols of gold and wood. That is what I see." That is what I fight for. That is what you have placed yourself in the path of." Shahanshah laughed. The sound was harsh, brittle, the laugh of a man who has heard too many promises and seen too many of them broken. "Justice," he repeated. "How many men have died today for your justice? How many widows will weep tonight because you decided that your vision of the world was worth more than their husbands' lives? Do not speak to me of justice. Justice is a word that conquerors use to make their conquests taste less like blood. You are no different from me. You are no different from any man who has ever held a sword and wanted more than he was given." "Then let the Almighty judge between us," Orhan Sahib said, and he charged. The fight was not like the fight between Jarkutai and Damia Khan. That had been a contest of skill, of technique, of the precise application of training against training. This was something else. This was rage meeting rage. This was two men who had spent years defining themselves in opposition to each other finally being given the opportunity to settle the question directly, personally, without the mediation of armies and strategies and diplomatic maneuvers. Shahanshah was skilled. He had been trained by the best swordsmen that Byzantine gold could buy. He knew the angles, the distances, the timing. He knew how to defend and how to attack, and how to make his opponent's strength work against him. But Orhan Sahib was something beyond skilled. He fought like a man who had made a promise to the Almighty and intended to keep it. He fought like a man who had buried too many brothers to allow their deaths to mean nothing. He fought like a man who carried the weight of a vision that was larger than himself, larger than Shahanshah, larger than this battlefield or this day or this war. His blade found Shahanshah's guard and broke through it. Not with a single stroke, but with a relentless series of strikes, each one delivered with perfect timing, each one creating an opening for the next, each one driving Shahanshah backward, forcing him to react rather than act, to defend rather than attack, to feel, for the first time in his life, what it was like to face someone who was simply, undeniably better. Shahanshah's horse stumbled. The animal was exhausted, pushed beyond its limits, and the stumble threw Shahanshah off balance. Orhan Sahib did not hesitate. His blade swept down, not at Shahanshah but at the horse's reins, severing them, and Shahanshah lost control, and the horse reared and Shahanshah fell. He landed hard on the churned earth. His sword flew from his grip. He scrambled for it, his fingers clawing at the dirt, but Turhan was there, appearing as though from nowhere, and his boot came down on Shahanshah's wrist, pinning his hand to the ground, and his sword pressed against Shahanshah's throat. Shahanshah went still. Orhan Sahib dismounted. He approached slowly, deliberately, his sword still drawn, his eyes never leaving Shahanshah's face. Around them, the battlefield had gone quiet. The fighting had stopped. Both sides had turned to watch, understanding that whatever happened in the next few moments would determine the outcome not just of this battle, but of everything that would follow. Orhan Sahib stood over his fallen enemy. He looked down at the man who had plotted against him, conspired against him, sent assassins and traitors and armies against him. He looked at the face that had haunted his counsels and his nightmares and his prayers for years. And then he spoke. "This is not the end you deserve," he said. "A quick death on a battlefield, a clean death, a death with honor, after everything you have done, after Burhan, after the treacheries, the broken treaties, the innocent blood spilled for your ambition, you deserve worse." He paused, the tip of his sword hovered over Shahanshah's chest. Every man watching held his breath. "But I am not the instrument of vengeance," Orhan Sahib continued. "I am the instrument of justice. And justice demands not that I kill you here, but that I show the world what you are, that your defeat be witnessed, that your shame be recorded, that every ruler who thinks to follow your path sees what awaits him at the end of it." He sheathed his sword. "Take him," he said to Turhan. "He will be tried. He will answer for what he has done. And when the judgment is pronounced, it will be pronounced in the light of day, before the eyes of history." Turhan hauled Shahanshah to his feet. The emperor, the inheritor, the man who had believed himself destined to rule, stood now in chains that his own pride had forged, surrounded by enemies, abandoned by his men, stripped of everything that had made him feel powerful. He tried to speak, his lips moved, but no words came. For the first time in his life, Shahanshah had nothing to say. The Byzantine army surrendered, not all at once but in waves, as the news of Shahanshah's capture spread across the field. Officers threw down their swords. Common soldiers dropped their spears and raised their hands. The fighting died not with a final clash but with a gradual fading, a slow release of tension, a collective exhalation that seemed to come from the earth itself. Orhan Sahib stood in the center of the battlefield and watched his men begin the long work of aftermath. The wounded to be tended, the dead to be gathered, the prisoners to be secured, the ground to be consecrated with prayers for those who had fallen on both sides, because even enemies deserved the dignity of a proper burial. Even those who had stood against the cause of justice deserved to be returned to the earth that had made them. Flavius approached.
His armor was dented, his face was cut, his voice was hoarse from shouting orders through hours of combat, but he was alive, and in his eyes was something that might have been pride or might have been relief, or might have been simply the raw, unprocessed awareness that they had survived something that should have killed them. "It is done," Flavius said. Orhan Sahib shook his head. "It is begun," he corrected. "The battle is done. The war continues. There are fortresses still held by Shahanshah's loyalists. There are Byzantine nobles who will not accept this defeat. There are other enemies watching, calculating, wondering if this is the moment to strike while we are weakened." Flavius nodded. He had known this, they all had. Victory was never a destination. It was merely a way station on a road that had no end. "And Yakid," Flavius said. The name tasted like poison on his tongue. "He is still out there." Orhan Sahib's face hardened. "Yes," he said. "Yakid is still out there, and Yakid will be found. Yakid will be brought before us. Yakid will answer for Burhan, for the treachery, for every Osmanli life that his betrayal has cost." He looked toward the horizon, toward the forests where Yakid had vanished, toward the darkness that always seemed to gather where men like Yakid made their homes. "Send riders," he said. "Send scouts. Spread the word. Every village, every town, every crossroads. A reward for information. A price on his head that will make even his closest allies consider betrayal. Yakid does not escape. Yakid does not hide forever. Yakid faces the same justice that Shahanshah will face. This is not a request. This is an oath. This is a promise. This is what will happen." Flavius bowed his head. "It will be done," he said. And it would be done, because when Orhan Sahib made a promise, the world had learned to listen. In Bursa, the news arrived before the army did. Riders had been dispatched as soon as the battle turned, carrying the word of victory, of Shahanshah's capture, of the beginning of a new chapter in the long story of the Osmanli rise. And in the palace, that news was received with joy and with tears, and with the complex mixture of emotions that always accompanies the end of existential danger. Malhun Khatun heard the news and closed her eyes, and whispered a prayer of thanksgiving that seemed to go on forever, that seemed to contain within it every fear she had held during every day of the campaign, every sleepless night, every moment of wondering if this would be the last time she saw her husband alive. Nilafar heard the news, and felt a surge of relief followed immediately by the return of the anxiety that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with what the war's end would bring. Orhan Sahib was coming home, and with him, presumably, was coming a sporker. And the triangle that had been stretched by distance would now be compressed by proximity, and whatever tensions had been building would soon have no choice but to find their resolution. She went to her mother. She sat beside Malhun and took her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that Malhun did not already know, nothing that required words when a daughter's grip told the whole story. Malhun looked at her. The old woman's eyes were kind but not naive. She had seen too much, survived too much, navigated too many palace intrigues to pretend that everything would simply be fine. "The Sultan returns victorious," Malhun said. "This is a time for celebration. This is a time to set aside what divides us and come together as a family, as a household, as a people who have been delivered from danger." Nilafar nodded. She knew what her mother was saying. She knew what was expected. But the heart did not always follow the expectations of duty, and the wounds that Gonya's words had opened were still fresh, still bleeding, still waiting for a treatment that might never come. "I will try," she said. It was the most honest answer she could give. In another part of the palace, Alauddin sat alone. Gonya's body had been washed and prepared and buried with the proper rites. The prayers had been said. The mourners had come and gone. And now Alauddin sat in the room that had been theirs, surrounded by her belongings, by the clothes she would never wear again, by the perfumes that still held the ghost of her presence, by the absence that was louder than any sound. He did not weep. He had wept already, wept until there were no tears left, wept until his body had simply refused to produce any more evidence of his grief. Now he sat in a stillness that was not peace but exhaustion, the stillness of a man who has been hollowed out by loss and does not yet know what will fill the emptiness. The news of victory reached him. A servant delivered it, standing in the doorway, uncertain whether to approach, uncertain whether any news, even news of triumph, was appropriate for a man in mourning. Alauddin listened, he nodded, he said nothing. The servant withdrew. And Alauddin continued to sit, alone in the room that still smelled of his rose, his Gonya, his love, wondering what purpose remained for him in a world that had taken from him the only thing that had made purpose feel meaningful. In time, he would find that purpose. In time, the grief would become not smaller but more manageable, a weight that he carried rather than a weight that crushed him. In time, he would ride again, would fight again, would serve the cause that his family had always served.
But not tonight. Tonight he sat. Tonight he remembered. Tonight he allowed himself to be simply a man who had loved a woman and lost her. The army returned 3 days later. The road to Bursa was lined with people. They had come from every village in the region, come to see the Sultan who had defeated the emperor, come to see the Osmanli banner carried in triumph through their streets. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Women leaned from windows. Old men who had fought in earlier campaigns stood at attention as the cavalry passed, their hands raised in salutes that needed no explanation. Orhan Sahib rode at the head of the column. His armor had been cleaned, his banner had been repaired, and he sat his horse with the straight-backed dignity of a man who understood that this ride was as much a performance as any battle. The people needed to see their sultan victorious. They needed to see strength and certainty. They needed to believe that the future was secure. Behind him rode the commanders. Turhan, ever watchful, his eyes scanning the crowds not for threats but for any sign of disorder that might need to be addressed. Flavius, his wounds bandaged, his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who has paid a debt he did not know he owed. Jakutai, quiet, withdrawn, still processing the valley where he had killed Damia Khan and lost something of himself that he was not yet ready to name. And behind the commanders, in a covered wagon that shielded her from public view, rode a sporker. She had not spoken much during the journey back. She had sat in the wagon, looking out through gaps in the canvas at the countryside passing by, at the land that was now undeniably her home. She had thought about the monastery, about Shahanshah, about the chamber where the candle had been extinguished and the darkness had pressed in around her, about Orhan Sahib's words, about who she was now supposed to be. She had not reached any conclusions. The thoughts simply circled, refusing to land, refusing to become decisions. She was suspended between who she had been and who she was becoming, and the journey between those two places seemed longer than any road she had ever traveled. The palace gates opened, the column passed through, the crowds were left behind, and the relative quiet of the inner courtyard descended like a held breath. Orhan Sahib dismounted. He handed his horse to a groom. He stood for a moment, looking up at the palace walls, at the windows where he knew his wives were watching, at the building that was both home and prison and kingdom all at once. Then he walked inside. Malhun met him in the entrance hall. She embraced him and he held her, and neither of them spoke, because words would have diminished the moment rather than enhanced it. She pulled back, looked at his face, touched the new lines that the campaign had carved around his eyes. "You are home," she said. "I am home," he agreed. And then he looked past her to where Nilafar stood a few paces back, her face carefully composed, her hands folded in front of her, her posture communicating dignity and restraint and the complex emotions that she would not allow to show on her surface. He went to her, he took her hands, he looked into her eyes. "You have been strong," he said. "I know what it costs. I know what I ask of you. I do not ask it lightly." Nilafar met his gaze. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "I am your wife," she said. "I will always stand beside you, but do not ask me to pretend that standing is easy. Do not ask me to smile when my heart is heavy. Give me time, give me the respect of honesty. That is all I ask." Orhan Sahib nodded. He did not promise that everything would be simple. He did not claim that the tensions would simply dissolve. He simply nodded, acknowledging her pain, acknowledging his role in causing it, acknowledging that the work of a marriage was never finished, that it required constant attention, constant effort, constant willingness to see the other person as they truly were rather than as one wished them to be. "I hear you," he said. "I will do what I can." It was not enough, it was never enough, but it was honest, and honesty was something Nilafar could build upon. Esporka was brought to the palace later, through a side entrance, away from the main crowds. She walked through corridors that she half remembered, past servants who looked at her with curiosity and something that might have been sympathy, and arrived finally at the chambers that had been prepared for her. They were the same chambers she had left, the same furniture, the same view from the window, the same silence that filled the space between the stone walls. She stood in the center of the room and looked around, and she felt like a stranger in a place that was supposed to be her home. A knock at the door. She turned. Orhan Sahib stood in the doorway. He entered slowly, closing the door behind him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. The sultan and the princess, the husband and the wife, the conqueror and the conquered, except that the categories were not so simple anymore, had never been so simple, would never be simple again. "You left," he said. His voice was not accusatory, it was curious, as though he genuinely wanted to understand. "I did not know where I belonged," she answered. "I did not know if I was your wife or your prisoner. I did not know if this palace was my home or my cage. I went to the only place I knew, the only place that had once been mine." Orhan Sahib crossed the room to the window.
He looked out at the courtyard below, at the soldiers and servants, and all the mechanisms of empire that continued to function regardless of what dramas played out in the chambers above. "You are my wife," he said. "That is not a political arrangement that can be undone by distance. It is not a contract that you can void by leaving. When I stood before the Almighty and spoke the words that bound us together, I meant those words. I will mean them until I die." He turned to face her. "But being my wife does not mean being invisible. It does not mean hiding in corners while others claim the space that is rightfully yours. It does not mean running to monasteries when the world becomes difficult. Being my wife means standing. It means facing. It means becoming something more than you were, something more than your father's daughter, something that has never existed before." Esporka felt something shift inside her, not a sudden transformation, not a dramatic revelation, something slower, something that might have been the first stirring of the person she was being asked to become. "Teach me," she said. The words surprised her even as she spoke them. "Teach me how to be what you need. I cannot promise to become it overnight. I cannot promise that there will be no struggle, but I can promise to try. I can promise to stop running." Orhan Sahib looked at her, studied her, assessed her the way he would assess a new recruit, looking for strength, for potential, for the spark that could be fanned into a flame. "Then we begin tomorrow," he said. "There is much to learn, and the world will not wait while you learn it." He left, the door closed behind him. Esporka stood alone in her chambers, and she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. Purpose, direction, the sense that the road ahead, difficult as it would be, led somewhere rather than nowhere. She went to the window. She looked out at the same courtyard, the same view that Orhan Sahib had studied moments before. She tried to see it the way he saw it, not as a prison yard but as a kingdom, not as a cage but as a responsibility. It would take time, it would take effort, it would require her to become someone she had never imagined becoming. But she had promised to try. And Esporka, whatever else she might be, was not a woman who broke her promises. In the days that followed, the machinery of governance resumed its endless churning. Shahanshah was brought before a tribunal, not a secret tribunal, a public one, held in the great square of Bursa where thousands could witness, where the proceedings could be recorded by scribes and transmitted by messengers to every corner of the known world. The charges were read, the evidence was presented, the witnesses spoke, and Shahanshah, who had expected either quick execution or a negotiated release, discovered that Orhan Sahib had meant exactly what he said. Justice in the light of day, before the eyes of history. The verdict was delivered by a council of judges, men known for their learning and their piety and their incorruptibility. They deliberated for 3 days, they reviewed the evidence, they consulted the texts, and then they announced their decision. Shahanshah was guilty, guilty of treaty violations, guilty of ordering the deaths of innocents, guilty of conspiring to destabilize the Osmanli Sultanate through assassination and sabotage, guilty of crimes that stretched back decades and that had cost countless lives. The sentence was exile, not death, exile to a remote fortress, to live out his remaining years under guard, stripped of power, stripped of influence, stripped of everything that had made him feel that he mattered. It was, in many ways, a worse punishment than death. Death would have ended his suffering. Exile extended it. Exile forced him to watch as the world moved on without him, as his name became first a warning and then a footnote and finally a thing forgotten. Shahanshah screamed his protests as he was led away. He threatened, he cursed, he predicted that the Osmanli would fall, that their empire would crumble, that history would remember him as a martyr and Orhan Sahib as a tyrant. No one listened. History was already writing its own verdict, and it disagreed with him. Meanwhile, the hunt for Yaqid continued. Flavius took personal command of the search. He rode out with a small force, following every rumor, investigating every report, tracking the traitor through a landscape that had become hostile to him, because Orhan Sahib's offer of reward had done its work. Every village, every crossroads, every traveler's inn had become a potential source of information. People who had once sheltered Yaqid now competed to be the first to betray him. People who had once feared his power now saw an opportunity for profit. Yaqid ran. He ran from hiding place to hiding place, always one step ahead, always finding some new refuge, some new ally who had not yet heard of the price on his head, or who was foolish enough to believe that he could extract a better deal from Yaqid than from Orhan Sahib. But the net was tightening. And in the forests, in the darkness, in the quiet hours when even fugitives must sleep, Yaqid felt it tightening. He felt the walls closing in. He felt the future shrinking with every day, every hour, every heartbeat.
He tried to send messages to old allies, to potential patrons who might shelter him in exchange for his skills. The messages went unanswered. His name had become poison. His reputation had become a warning. No one wanted to be associated with a traitor who had failed. In one last desperate gamble, he made for the border. If he could reach Byzantine territory, reach some remnant of Shahanshah's old network, he might find shelter, might find purpose, might find a way to continue his war against the Osmanli. He was intercepted 2 days from the border. Flavius found him in a ravine, surrounded by the last handful of men who had remained loyal to him. They were exhausted, starving, their weapons blunted, their spirits broken. They saw the Osmanli force approaching, and they knew that fighting was pointless. Most of them surrendered. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands, and hoped that their surrender might earn them mercy. Yakid did not surrender. He drew his sword, he looked at Flavius, and on his face was not fear, not regret, something stranger, something that might have been relief. "You will tell them," he said, "that I did not kneel, that I did not beg, that when the end came, I faced it as a warrior faces it." Flavius dismounted. He drew his own sword. He approached Yakid slowly, without rushing, without any of the hurry that had characterized the search. "I will tell them," he said, "that you were a traitor, that you betrayed your brothers, that you sold your soul for promises that could never have been kept. I will tell them that you died as traitors die, alone and unmourned, and that your name will be spoken only as a warning to others who might consider the path you chose." Yakid's face twisted. For a moment, it seemed that he might scream, might rage, might unleash some final curse upon the world that had defeated him. Instead, he attacked. The fight was brief. Yakid was exhausted, malnourished, fighting on shattered reserves of strength that had been depleted by weeks of running. Flavius was fresh, focused, empowered by the righteousness of the cause he served. Their blades met once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th exchange, Flavius found the opening. His blade drove forward, found Yakid's chest, found the heart that had chosen treachery over loyalty. Yakid fell. He lay on the rocky ground of the ravine, his blood soaking into soil that would not remember him, his eyes staring up at a sky that offered no answers. His lips moved. Perhaps he was trying to speak. Perhaps he was praying. Perhaps he was simply feeling the last sensations of a life that had chosen its own ending. Flavius watched him die. He did not look away. He owed the dead that much. He owed all the men that Yakid had betrayed the witness of seeing their betrayer meet his end. When it was over, when the light had faded from Yakid's eyes, Flavius sheathed his sword. "It is finished," he said. One of his men asked if they should bury the body. Flavius considered. He thought about Burhan, about the warriors who had fallen because of this man's betrayal, about the families who would never see their sons and fathers again. "Leave him for the birds and beasts," he said. "Let his fate be as he promised for others." They rode away. And behind them in the ravine, the forest began its slow work of reclamation. The body that had been Yakid would disappear. The name would linger for a time, spoken in disgust, used as an example, incorporated into stories told to children about what happens when loyalty fails. And then even the name would fade. And it would be as though Yakid had never been. Which was, perhaps, the only justice that truly fit his crime. Back in Bursa, Orhan Sahib received the news of Yakid's death. He stood alone in his chamber, looking out at the city that had become the heart of his growing empire, and he allowed himself a moment of something that was almost peace. Almost. Because the war was not over, the war was never over. Shahanshah was exiled, but his allies remained. Yakid was dead, but his methods could be imitated. The Byzantine Empire was weakened, but it was not destroyed. And beyond the Byzantines were other enemies, other rivals, other forces that watched the Osmanli rise with jealousy and fear and calculation. Orhan Sahib understood this. He had always understood this. The work of building something lasting was never finished. It required vigilance and sacrifice, and the willingness to rise each morning knowing that the day would bring new challenges, new obstacles, new opportunities for failure. He turned from the window. He called for his commanders. There was planning to do, fortresses to garrison, treaties to negotiate, an empire to build. The war continued. But it continued with hope. It continued with the knowledge that justice, however imperfect, had been served. It continued with the memory of Burhan Flavius, who had died for the cause and whose death had not been in vain. It continued with the transformation of a sporker, who was learning slowly what it meant to be a Khartoum of the Osmanli. It continued with the quiet grief of a Lordin, who would rise again when the time was right. It continued with the vigilance of Turhan, the fury of Flavius, the steadfast loyalty of Jarkutai, and all the others who had given their swords and their souls to the vision that Orhan Sahib carried. The war continued. But so did the hope. And hope in the end was stronger than any army. Stronger than any treachery. Stronger than any empire that had ever risen or would ever fall. Hope endured. And as long as hope endured, the story was not finished. The story was never finished. It simply passed from one generation to the next, each generation adding its chapter, each chapter building on what came before, until the story became something larger than any single person, larger than any single battle, larger than anything that could be contained in words. It became history. And history, whatever else might be said about it, never truly ended. It only paused. It only waited. It only prepared itself for the next chapter. And the next chapter was always coming. Always approaching. Always ready to be written in blood and fire and steel and hope. The night fell over Bursa. The stars appeared, ancient and indifferent, watching as they had always watched, judging as they would always judge. And in the palace, in the chambers where power was exercised and decisions were made, Orhan Sahib sat alone with his maps and his plans and his prayers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tomorrow would also bring new opportunities. And Orhan Sahib, Sultan of the Osmanli, servant of the Almighty, husband and father and warrior and builder, would face them as he had faced everything. With faith, with courage, with the unshakable certainty that the cause he served was worth every sacrifice it demanded. The war was not over. But the war would be won. This he believed. This he knew. This was the truth that sustained him through every darkness, every doubt, every moment when the world pressed in too tightly. The war would be won. And everything that had been sacrificed would be redeemed. In time, the night deepened. The stars watched. And history, patient and eternal, waited for the next chapter to begin.